fumigation. Now, there's a historian, Hereward Tilton, who has argued that psychoactive substances were central to Rosicrucian and alchemical traditions. And many of these anticholinergics are prominent in the early modern and medieval texts that talk about these magical fumigations and how to work with them. And these are all texts that the Smiths were familiar with. So, for instance, Cornelius Agrippa cites a passage from Marcello Ficino, another magician, on attracting spirits of the stars with fumigations. And he listed a bunch of psychoactive fumigations from the medieval magical text containing spirit herbs. Now, these practices within Agrippa's greater purpose served to ascend towards self-deification, which was the goal of a lot of Agrippa's work. And this is extremely common with Joseph Smith, the idea that we all can become gods, and the common trope of as God is, or as man is, God once was, and as God is, man may become. So it was central in both Agrippa and in Joseph Smith's worldviews. Now, Joseph Smith also utilized the Urim and Thummim in his translations, and this paralleled the Rosicrucian usage of objects that they called the Urim and Thummim in these scrying spiritual or hidden texts. And they would utilize these psychedelic fumigations in their scrying practices. And Joseph used a cane that was engraved with serpent, which parallels the Gnostic and Rosicrucian usage of the spiraling serpent in psychedelic texts. Now, of particular interest is that the scripture James 1:5, which was the foundation of Joseph's first vision, was actually inscribed inside covers of various Rosicrucian texts that dealt with these psychedelic substances and this broader idea of seeking wisdom. So there we have a direct link between Rosicrucianism and seeking wisdom with James 1:5 and Joseph Smith doing the exact same thing, utilizing the same substances. So now we'll move to the Masonic influences on Joseph Smith. So Masonry, while it existed in the 15 and 1600s, was officially organized likely in 1717. Now, central to Masonry is this idea, or is the allegory of Hiram Abiff. So Hiram Abiff was the chief architect in the construction of the Temple of Solomon. And during the construction, 3 fellow Masons ambushed him, seeking the Master Mason's word, or the secrets, and they ultimately killed him in doing so. Now, Hiram Abiff, as it was said, was buried under an acacia sprig, and as King Solomon went to find the body of Hiram Abiff, he had to reach below the ground, and as the story goes, he utilized the different grips of the Master Mason to raise him up. And as many writers have argued, that the Solomon raising Hiram from the ground using these resembles a ritualized acacia harvest. And acacia is a psychedelic substance, or contains the psychedelic substance DMT. And the root bark of the acacia tree contains the highest concentration of DMT. And so Solomon, utilizing specific grips to reach Hiram Abiff out, parallels the ritualized acacia harvest. Now, after Solomon had found Hiram's body, he declared the secret word of the Master Masons lost forever. Although, interestingly, in some continental European traditions, the lost words are actually found under an acacia sprig. So something utilizing DMT. Now, another Mason, Count Cagliostro, or Alessandro Cagliostro, wrote in 1784 an Egyptian rite. And note, Joseph was obsessed with all things Egyptian, and was undoubtedly familiar with an Egyptian Masonic rite referencing DMT and the secret rites. Now, Cagliostro referred to acacia as the first matter in alchemical operations that resulted in a crystalline salt, the same thing that DMT is once it's extracted. Now, the candidate, this was then mixed into a drink, and the candidate would drink it prior to a long speech so that they could understand the words of the Master Mason who would be speaking to them, or Count Cagliostro. And this resembles Joseph Smith's use in the June 3rd, 4th, 1831 conference, where he gave everyone a presumably psychedelic sacrament and proceeded to speak for a while and until the drugs kicked in so that they could understand what was coming next. Now, Arturo de Hoyos, he's the Grand Historian and Grand Archivist of the Scottish Rite, who also happened to study at BYU, said that the master degree of Masonry speaks to the use of the acacia found upon Hiram's grave. This DMT is the true matter from which the philosophers create their treasures, and it is the true light of the world, from which glorious Hiram shall rise again under the guise of the Redeemer. So there we see the Masonic historian, who also went to BYU, so presumably is a Mormon, connecting DMT with Masonic rites. Now, there are further Masonic connections. For example, Hiram Smith was originally spelled with an I instead of a Y to parallel the name of Hiram Abiff, the same spelling. And Hiram Smith's teacher at Dartmouth was John Smith, who was a master Mason and a scholar of ancient Greece. And at that time, Masons were attempting to link the ancient orders of the Greeks and Egyptians to Masonry. So they were interested in this ancient order of things. And John Smith, a scholar of ancient Greece, connected Masonic rituals with the ancient Greek mysteries of Eleusis, which were a psychedelic rite for those who aren't familiar. Now, another Masonic fellow at the time, John Fellows, wrote that it is this drug that was given to the initiates in Eleusis that aided the impression of the mystic visions that they came. And they would give this medicated drugs to the aspirants, and the rites of Catholic Church and the pagan religions were all derived from this ancient institution, as was Masonry. So now we'll move to the Native American use of psychedelics at the time. Now we know that Joseph Smith was familiar with Native American lore, and he was clearly interested in it, given that the Book of Mormon was addressed to the Lamanites and the Native Americans, and he would send missionaries first out to the Native Americans. Growing up, they lived near many of the tribes of Iroquois County, and his mother talked about how he would regale the family with all of these different tales from the Native American lore as well. And we know that the Native Americans at the time, all across America, but especially in the northeastern tribes, they used datura as the base of a drink that was used in these manhood initiation rites. Now, this was a vision quest rite where the young man would acquire a spirit and establish a personal connection with the native world, which would help him employ his powers in the world in the right ways. Now, in the history of Virginia, where this is recorded by some of the Jesuits, Beverly's, the historian, wrote that these Native Americans would drink so much that the water of Lethe, that they would perfectly lose the remembrance of all former things. Now, Lethe is the Greek river of forgetfulness in the underworld. So there's a direct link between the Eleusinian mysteries, which centered around Demeter and Persephone, the wife of Hades, god of the underworld, with the Native American tradition. They saw them as one and the same thing. And this is what Joseph Smith was stepping into at the time. So now we'll move to Joseph's family, but first we have to start with the aunts that he never met, that died before he was born. So Levisa Mack was Lucy Mack's older sister, and she was sick for many years, which baffled all the doctors, and eventually they were like, she's dying, there's nothing we can do. So the family were like, oh no, she can't heal, and that night, the night that they were told that, Levisa dreamed a dream, and it was of this medicated wine that would cure her. So Solomon Mack, her father, reports that they went and made the wine and brought it to her. And she went back to sleep and had a vision. And after the vision, she was miraculously cured. But she said that God raised her up, and she's come to tell everyone to prepare for death. She talks about being born away in the world of spirits, where she saw the Savior as through a veil, and the veil looked as though as it was a spider's web, which is a frequent experience among DMT users as well. Now, during this vision, Jesus spoke to her and told her to warn others of their impending doom, because everybody must prepare for death, because everyone must die and then be reborn. And if you have any any connection to the psychedelic world, you'll know that death and rebirth is the constant theme that everybody talks about within psychedelics. It's the experience that everybody has on it, and it is central to many of the growth that people experience. Now, the other idea that Levisa was suddenly and miraculously healed, there are many such cases of these miraculous healings utilizing psychedelics. Like there are documented cases of cancer, of HIV, of anemia, and heart issues just being miraculously cured through some sort of psychedelic substance. Now, soon after, Levina, the sister of Levisa, contracted consumption and began preparing for death. And at her deathbed, as the family was gathered around, she told everyone to have a change of heart, the same that she and Levisa had had. Now, Lucy was 13 when this happened, and soon after, Levisa died as well. So Lucy went and stayed with her brother Stephen, who owned a tavern at the time, because she was inconsolable. Now, while at the Mac home, Lucy wrote that she was determined to obtain that which I had heard spoken of so much by my family, a change of heart. Now, she married before she could experience this change of heart, and her new husband's religious beliefs didn't focus on a spiritual rebirth at the time. So, but first we have to talk about the Mac and the Smith families as brewers. Now, we know that Lucy's brother Stephen owned a large tavern in Tunbridge, and Lucy Mac worked there and grew up with tavern experience. And her other sister, Lydia, also owned a tavern that Lucy would work at. And it appears that Lucy did meet her husband, Joseph Smith Sr., at that very tavern in Tunbridge. Now, we know that Lucy continued to rely on her tavern experience for years after she left Vermont. When she moved to Palmyra, she started a cake and beer shop which commanded brisk sales, and she was known for having unusually heady beer. Now, we know that she continued because when she moved with the Saints in Missouri, she considered her business that of keeping tavern. Now, Mark Staker and Don Enders, who are the historians who've done the most work here, have concluded that the Mac family brewed beer over many generations. We also know that the Smiths were hop farmers. It was the first cash crop grown in their hometown of Tunbridge, and Joseph Smith Sr., as well as his brother Jesse, had the necessary skills to make the components necessary for brewing beer. And recent work at the archaeological work at the Smith homestead confirms that they did farm hops and indicates that they did brew beer. So what does brewing beer have to do with psychedelics? Well, beer is not only water, hops, and barley in this time, but any number of spices and herbs were added to improve taste, as a medicinal delivery, and to make it more intoxicating. So beer was made out of any number of things and included a large number of herbs. And as you can see here, there's a list of some of the family-friendly ingredients that were added to beer at the time. However, there were also psychoactive additives to beer at the time. Darnell was a popular one that showed up throughout the beer, and it would creep intentionally and unintentionally into it. But also datura, henbane, mandrake, and mugwort, all psychoactive substances, were used frequently as additives. Now, Brian Murarescu, who wrote The Immortality Key, has popularized the research that's really shown that spiked beer is a long tradition throughout history and has existed for thousands of years. So it's very common that we see this psychoactive beer being utilized. Now, in 1803, Joseph Sr. identified, harvested, and processed a bunch of ginseng to sell in Chinese markets. And ginseng had secret magical powers, and it can have mild psychoactive effects. So we see from this and the beer brewing that the Smiths were drug dealers, essentially, just kosher drug dealers. So now we'll move to the familial visions of Solomon Mack, Joseph's grandfather. Now, Solomon Mack had multiple trees fall on his head while he was clearing land, and this nearly killed him on multiple occasions. Yeah, he had multiple trees. It happened 3 different times. And then he kept falling off of his horse and hitting his head. So we know that he started having these fits and these seizures, which culminated in epilepsy. And at the time, the leading treatment for epilepsy was datura, a psychedelic substance. And it apparently was a miracle cure. The crazy thing is they would keep these patients under the influence of datura for months at a time. Now, they would do the same thing to the Native American initiates, the young men. They would give them datura so that they would have a long series of visions. They would have to continue to partake of the substance. So similarly, people with epilepsy were under the influence of datura for a long series of time. Now, after a series of these seizures in Tunbridge in the fall of 1810, Solomon reports that he was taken with rheumatism, and it confined him all winter. Now, the leading treatment for rheumatism at the time was also datura. And it was while he was under the treatment for rheumatism that Solomon began having visions and had his mighty change of heart. Up until this point, he had little interest in Christianity or religion in general. But Solomon Mack had visionary experiences that led him to convert. And he published this his narrative autobiography just a year after these visions were said to occur. So these are accounts of his visions. And Solomon experienced these bouts of paranoia prior to his vision. He experienced light coming towards him and this eventual relief from everything, which are all common side effects of a Datura account and are reminiscent of his grandson's first vision, as well as his later visions of the angel Moroni coming to him in his bedroom at night, the light coming towards him. Now we'll move to Joseph Smith Sr. and Lucy Mack's dreams. So Lucy, in around 1803 or 1804, was having a hard time with her husband and his lack of religion. So she went and prayed and returned to the house much depressed in spirit, which the state of feeling continued until she retired to bed and went to sleep. Now, she had this vision or this dream where she saw a meadow that was near their house, and everything was peculiarly pleasant. She saw a stream running through and two trees on the same side of the stream in this experience. Now, these trees were beautiful. They were well proportioned. They had symmetry and glory, and there was a bright light surrounding one of them, which appeared like a belt of burnished gold. And these trees were encircled with a golden zone and gracefully before the wind and waved its beautiful branches in the light air. Now, Amanita muscaria is an onerogen, which is a substance that helps you fall asleep and have visionary dreams. Many people that use Amanita muscaria report this golden zone or this golden ring appearing around objects. And there are subjective effects of the experience. They see these objects animated and dancing like we see in Lucy's account. And there's this pulsing or breathing, this wavy motion in the visual field, and an alive quality to inanimate objects. There's symmetrical visuals like we saw in Lucy's, and pleasant feelings. Now, let's see if this works. For example, these are a couple examples of replications people have made to try to mimic the type of experience. You can see the bark was breathing in and out. Let's see if it'll work again. And you see the increase in glory and brightness of the vision on the one on the left. Colors become more heightened. Now, Lucy's vision contained many of these subjective effects that are common to Amanita. So if we look further at her report, the trees assume lively and animated appearance. It expresses its motion in the utmost joy. It swells gently and recedes. It breathes. And the belt does the same, and they move in unison with each other. Now, this past fall, my friend Don Bradley and I got the chance to go to Tunbridge and visit the Smiths family home. Now, on the left, left for you guys too. That's the foundation, or what's left of the Smith family home in Tunbridge. It's been covered over so that it's protected. And you see the garden in the background. If you look on the right, that garden is the same one in the picture, so this is looking in. And in that forest on the other side, Dawn and I found Amanita muscaria everywhere. And I'm not just talking like one or two mushrooms scattered about. There were hundreds of them everywhere. And this is on the Smiths property, because in the same forest is the wall left over from the Smith family there. So we see Lucy having a report of a dream in Tunbridge, and Amanita muscaria is present on site. Now, the outcome of Lucy's vision was that her mood was lightened, and she concluded that her husband would eventually share her feelings. And a few years later, Joseph Smith Sr. would have this happen through his entheogenic experiences. So in 1810, Joseph Smith Sr. related to his wife this dream that serves as his first vision. And Lucy reports just prior to this that at the time, her husband's mind was much excited upon the subject of religion, but he contended for the ancient order of things in a similar way to the Masons and the Rosicrucians that we see before. And this will become prevalent in just a moment. So he was in an open field, and he was alone in this desert, and he inquired the meaning of what he saw, because there was a spiritual attendant next to him. Now, he was told, well, you'll find on the log a box, and if you eat what's in the box, you'll have wisdom and understanding. And this will become important in a moment. But of course, he took it immediately and raised the lid and began to taste its contents. Then he had all these crazy beasts and animals come and threaten him, and he was terrified for his life, similar to a psychedelic experience where you're terrified for your life. But in the midst of all this, he says he was perfectly happy, and he woke trembling without fear. Now, to really appreciate this, we have to understand that Joseph Sr. was heavily invested in Masonry. And he and many of the other early Mormons believed that the murder of Hiram Abiff was a literal story. It wasn't an allegory. And so the secret of the Master's word, which was wisdom, was lost. And he was searching for this lost word of wisdom. Now, the outcome of Joseph's vision was that nobody had it right. So he would keep searching for the ancient order of things. Now, he had a second dream a year later where, again, he's in an open field and there's a guide and he sees a tree, and this tree is beautiful, and it spread themselves in the form of an umbrella, and it bore a kind of fruit in the shape much like a chestnut burr. So in the top left, you see a chestnut burr, and the other two pictures are datura seed pods. They're quite similar, and in the bottom you see a datura tree in the shape of an umbrella. So it's possible that that's the tree that he saw in this experience. However, this experience has extreme similarities to Lehi's vision in the Book of Mormon. He saw there was dazzling whiteness, the fruit was delicious, he wanted to bring his wife and kids, and they all commenced eating and praising God for this blessing. And again at the bottom, I soon awoke, clapping my hands together for joy. Now, it had many similarities to Lehi's vision of the Tree of Life, as you can see above. But of other interest is this Masonic connection, where the Book of Mormon begins at the same time period as the Royal Arch degree in Masonry, the reign of Zedekiah. And the Royal Arch uses Moses in the burning bush, this idea of a prophetic theophany and the return and recovery of truth. And in the Book of Mormon, Lehi is this principal sojourner and saw a vision before the Tree of Life. In both Masonry and in the Book of Mormon, they work towards rebuilding the temple. And Nephi's trip into Jerusalem to retrieve the plates is a reversal of the Masonic legend of Akira. Now, we can also compare this to Joseph Sr. seeking lost wisdom. Lehi and Nephi were finding wisdom. Now, Lehi's son Nephi wanted to know of the things that his father had experienced, and so he went and asked God, just like Joseph Smith wanted to. Now, after Joseph Jr.'s first vision, he also came away with the outlook that none of the religions contained any more wisdom than the other, just like his father did. However, Nephi's vision extends much further than his father's. Nephi sees the future of the Jews, the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, and similarly, Joseph Smith Jr.'s vision goes that much further than his father's as well, and culminates in him establishing what is God's church. Now, Joseph Smith, like his father, was participating in this long tradition of seeking wisdom and divine knowledge, and he went about it in the same reliable manner that the Rosicrucians, the Masons, and these other folk magicians did. And so Joseph wasn't only stepping into his parents' visionary quest, he was stepping into this ancient quest of all seekers of wisdom. Now, this theme of Joseph stepping into visionary quests that was opened by his father and opened by his mother becomes a theme in early Mormonism, where Joseph would open up visions and have other people step into them. This is clear he opens visions for individuals in the June 1831 conference, when he and Sidney Rigdon have the dual vision that results in the D&C 76. And Oliver Cowdery and Zebedee Colton report an experience where Joseph says, "Hey, now, brethren, we'll see some visions." And he opens up the heavens and lays down with his hands out like this, which is reminiscent of a Masonic form, as well as the Kabbalistic Tree of Life, and he guides them through a vision. So Joseph opens up these visions the same way his father opened up visions for him, and he guides other people through them. The Tree of Life is a prominent example within all of this. In Proverbs 3, we see, "Happy is the man that findeth wisdom, for she is a tree of life, and everyone is happy." Same with Revelation 2, "Everyone that overcomes gets to eat of the tree of life," or eat of wisdom. So the Tree of Life is synonymous with wisdom, and in the Book of Mormon and in Joseph's vision, this Tree of Life is what gives them wisdom, a psychedelic experience. So Joseph Jr. was stepping into something larger than himself. His father sought wisdom, not from any religion, but he got his wisdom from visions. Joseph's mother sought a change of heart and the correct religion, and she got that from visions. And all of this is surrounding Joseph as he embarks on his first vision, which was most likely facilitated by a psychedelic substance. Now, if we look at his first vision, we see James 1:5 featuring prominently, just like the Rosicrucian text. If any of you lack wisdom, if anybody needed wisdom, I did. And if he gave wisdom to them that lacked wisdom, then you might as well give it a go. Now, just to give you a taste of some of the work that's been done, these are symptoms of Joseph Smith's first vision that match on to psychedelic experience, thanks to Don and Rob's work. So there were many different routes through which the Smiths were introduced to psychedelics, and through the occult, through Masonry, through the Native Americans and the other herbalists at the time, and Joseph really was stepping into and transforming the visionary quests of both his father, his mother, and all of these ancient traditions. And Lucy saw the change of heart that was wrought in her sisters, and she wanted the same thing. And during her time at her brother's tavern, she learned how to cultivate these inebriating experiences and saw firsthand how her handiwork changed people's moods for the better and worse. She married and later has a vision of her husband having a change of heart. And at the same time as her husband is having visionary experiences, that around 1810 and 1811, her father is also having these visionary experiences. And Joseph Sr. was always searching for this ancient order of things, which is what Joseph Smith thought that he was restoring. So really, Joseph spent his entire life building on his father's work and realizing what his father was searching for. All right, Bryce?
All right. I'm going to give a little intro to Bryce. Thank you first, Alex. And then I want to say that you undersold yourself at the beginning with your qualifications. So I got to make sure that Bryce gets it right. Alex is very knowledgeable on the subject and has done several research papers, like he mentioned, and been involved in psychedelic studies and organizing, helping organizing ketamine clinics and such. I'm going to give a little intro for Bryce, and then I want to say that after Bryce speaks, we want to feel it out. We imagine there are going to be quite a few questions, and we're going to have our main speakers, and what we want to feel out after Bryce is, do we want to have a bit of an intermission, or do we want to have a Q&A after those first two speakers, as opposed to waiting to the end and having a Q&A with everyone. So we get a feel from that from the crowd after Bryce speaks, so it might be an intermission, might be an early Q&A. So, with all of that said, Bryce is the author and co-author of multiple research papers on the influence of psychedelics on early Mormonism, including the paper, The Entheogenic Origins of Mormonism, a Working Hypothesis. This was published in the Journal of Psychedelic Studies, and some of the other co-authors of that paper are also in the room today. So Bryce is also the creator of the hugely successful podcast, Naked Mormonism. And he shakes his head right there because I said hugely successful. What? I'm not overselling him. Bryce is a stellar LDS scholar today, and we're privileged to hear from him. And with that, Bryce, please step to the podium.
All right. So, in preparation for this symposium, and amidst traveling from the middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania, the banks of the Susquehanna, I'm a little underslept, a little jazzed up on caffeine, so I'm going to rely on my notes a bit, and probably not do a whole lot of tangents and off the cuff. But as we go along, I, of course, want to start by thanking the organizers here, Mormons on Mushrooms, Brandon Crockett, Cody Noconi, as well as my co-presenters, Alex and Marinda, for putting this together, for working to get this information out there and spread the love of entheogenic Mormonism, because this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. Today, my presentation is going to focus on the practical considerations and the logistics of what we call the Joseph Smith entheogen theory. And my talk is titled Joseph Smith's Psychedelic Sources and Suppliers, because if we're looking at this in a holistic approach, we need to understand that there are logistical constraints to providing psychedelics for large groups of people. And as the church grew more and more, obviously those logistical constraints became more and more strained. So these, let me wind back a little bit here. There's going to be time for Q&A. I have questions for you, Alex. If the audience doesn't, I have some questions for you. So I'm hoping that we can put our Q&As together. Maybe we can have a wandering microphone for the audience, because I want this to be as much of a conversation as it is a presentation. This is a symposium for all of us to participate in and enjoy. So yes, I've published with other authors on this subject. You can get tons more context by looking at those papers, and my last slide will include all of those papers. If you want to chase our footnotes, if you want to find our sources and see, check our work, we encourage it, we welcome it. So when I say the words practical considerations when it comes to Joseph Smith psychedelic suppliers, what do I mean? The first thing, of course, is going to be herbcraft. And then the second thing, it's a self-explanatory word, we'll talk about it in a second. The second one is going to be the logistics and the supply specifically. And then the third one is going to be the secrecy, the concealment, and the quorums of the church. So to begin, slide 1, herbcraft. What is herbcraft? It seems like a self-explanatory word, but it's kind of a niche word, but really it boils down to knowledge and familiarity with herbs and how to use it and utilize them, not just herbs, but plants generally, the entire flora. So, some plants, you can walk through the forest, pick them up, eat them, you're fine. Everything's great, they taste good, they're nutritious. Other plants need extraction methods in order to make them safe or effective or medicinal. So a master herbcraft can walk through the forest and they can identify all of the surrounding plants. They know what parts of the plants are useful for what purposes. They know what kitchen chemistry and pieces of alchemy are necessary in order to render them safe or effective. This is how herbcraft works. Herbalism is the term that's generally accepted, but herbcraft feels a little bit more appropriate for the terms of magic and occults, which is what we're going to get to here in a minute. So of course we want to start talking with nightshades. When we've done our research on this, the nightshades family seem to be one of those primary candidate entheogens that was likely used. And of course, Datura falls into that category. As Alex's slide presented, the Joseph Smith Senior dream almost perfectly describes it into a tree. So of course, one of our focuses is really here. So these plants, they illustrate a much larger point when we're considering nightshades. And that is the familiarity with various plants and herbs. Some plants, they have roots and fruits that are incredibly toxic. The top left picture, that's tomatoes. Eat the leaves, you could die. But the tomatoes themselves are delicious, right? So some of these plants, they have berries that are pretty, and they're delicious to the taste. But if you eat them, you will die. And that is very painful every minute that it's happening. So you can just ask Joseph Smith's eldest brother, Alvin Smith, what death by nightshade is like, and that's what we hypothesize. And of course, we do want to bring up fungus. Obviously, fungus are primary consideration here too. Some plants, they can be incredibly toxic as well, but with a little bit of herbcraft, a little chemistry, you can make it so it can be consumed, and it is psychoactive and entheogenic. So herbcraft, generally, it's a large and it's a necessary skill set to know what plants can be used for food, or what plants can be used for medicine, or for rituals, or for recreation, or what plants are best just to be left alone. However, this basis of knowledge of herbcrafting, it has degrees that can be learned precept upon precept. Young scouts at scout camp, they're usually not master herbcrafts, but they know the turn of phrase, leaves of 3, leave it be. And because they know that phrase, when they go out into the woods, they don't come back with a skin condition that the tenderest of baby creams can't solve. So knowledge of herbcraft comes in degrees. And let's just break it down in a very reductionist and simplistic way to look at this. For our purposes, let's just look at frontier American herbcraft and consider it with this overview here. These are the 3 degrees, if you will. The first level, this is the most populous level. And this is just represented just by regular folks who have some knowledge of herbcraft. They've picked up things here and there from friends. They've gone foraging with friends in the forest or whatever. They've learned something from their parents, something to that effect. They have maybe a few scraps of paper that have some recipes on them, so on and so forth. This is just a very basic, common, and they usually have just a tiny bit of knowledge of quite a few plants. When we move up to the second level, this is made up of just a menagerie of folks here who have risen above the first degree for whatever reason. Maybe they picked up some herbcraft knowledge in passing and then they found a passion for it. And, instead of just having a few scraps of paper with recipes on it, they have entire books because it's a passion and they want to learn all there is to know about the natural world. Oftentimes these folks in the second category are probably quite familiar with the local apothecary shop or who runs it if they themselves don't run it. And then finally, we move up to the third degree. And this is, of course, our masters, our experts, our professionals of herbcrafts. This is the least populous level, and it's marked by advanced training. And that training can either come in the form of organic training by learning it from working with the plants or from apprenticing under other people who are masters, or it can come in the form of formal training, going to school, going to academies, apprenticing under doctors, so on and so forth. Now, these folks here, they didn't just want to learn about herbs, they want to learn about the human body and how the human body interacts with herbs. They want to know how the chemicals that are in the plants being introduced into human chemistry affect that human the person. And these folks often become physicians. They were specialty doctors. They ran their own shops selling medicine and visiting patients. So when we consider the world of medicine today, like medicine hasn't always been like this. This is, these inventions, these are from the last century, right? With the exception of, some of the tools and of course the pills and capsules, those exist for a couple hundred years before the last century. But during the time frame under consideration, the early 19th century here, medicine looked very different from what we consider medicine today. And a person, if a person is sick, the principle overall is the same, though. Medicine works as a function of a process. A person is sick, they visit a doctor, the doctor treats their given ailment, they evaluate, the doctor and the patient evaluate the results, and then they make adjustments. The medicine still worked by the same principles, we just have lots of fancy, shiny tools for learning a lot more about our bodies nowadays. When we consider frontier medicine, this is where it really becomes kind of interesting for my focuses. Medicine in just the frontier America in kind of any given period as the expansion, as European American settling expansion moved westward, it's quite a fascinating world. When we consider it from kind of a total perspective, only the largest cities had dedicated medical establishments that were hospitals or sanitariums. When you move down to smaller cities and towns, they may have a few doctors who live there and work out of the towns or the smaller cities. They may work out of an office, or maybe a few physicians share the same office. Then when we move down into smaller towns and villages, oftentimes what the folks had to rely on there were traveling doctors that would travel to a bunch of different towns and villages on a weekly or a monthly rotation. But the problem is, like, illness doesn't happen on the doctor's schedule. It happens all the time. So people needed to understand basic medicine in order to keep a person alive for the doctor to finally arrive. I pressed the wrong button. There we go.
Sound projects. Yeah, we're gonna try it without the mic just to see how it projects to the back because we've heard that there's some echo. And so if you let us know, can you hear me right now in the back?
Yeah.
I can speak up a bit. Is that all right? Everybody in the back can hear me?
All right.
Okay, yeah, that works out great. So when we consider medicine, how does this converge with herbcraft? Really, they are in many ways kind of parts of the same piece of medicine. Many individuals who lived in 19th century America, 18th century America, frontier, they would pick up little tidbits of medical knowledge from each other. Practically considering it, one person might learn about one herb that helps cure physical pain. And then they tell 3 friends about it, and suddenly they go tell a few other friends, and then half of a town knows that this herb that looks like this, that can be found at this, planted here or widely growing here, suddenly half the town knows how to cure a common abrasion or something to that effect. So these things, this information often transfers organically among people, especially in small towns where everybody knows each other. And medicine, keeping people alive, relied on these people knowing each other and sharing this medical and herb crafting information with each other. And that is all to say, that exists apart from the formal training of actually going to medical academies, apprenticing under formal doctors, and so on and so forth. But it's no less relevant that having some level of herbcraft knowledge in frontier America saved lives every single day. It wasn't just a matter of going and picking herbs as well. It was distilled into all sorts of different methods to partake of the plant medicines. We have collyriums, we have these tinctures, we have unctions and salves, we have oils for anointings, we have teas, we have alcohols. I mean, all of these can be, they require a basis of knowledge to know how to distill the chemicals down into these vehicles. And this is information that you can learn just by spending some time with a friend in the kitchen. So visiting patients was a full-time job, especially for traveling doctors. And just like today's pharmacists, running an apothecary or a tincture shop, it was also a full-time job. So it was often the case that doctors would have a very good working relationship with whoever ran the local apothecary. And it was just like, doctors and pharmacists today, they work together to help a patient become cured of whatever illness they have. For smaller towns, often the person who was the local doctor was also the person running the apothecary shop too. So this herbcraft, the point I'm driving at here is this herbcraft is life-saving knowledge, and a lot of people had at least a little bit of that information. But because this is America, when there's a chance to make money from something that saves people's lives, of course, we have to find a way to make money out of it. So the dissemination of herbcraft knowledge, this kind of became a bit of a cottage industry, giving rise to what was known popularly as vegetable medicine. And here we get to introduce a hero to some and an anti-hero to others. This is Samuel Thompson. Thompsonian medicine. This is just a fascinating world of medical and cultural memography almost, because books with medical information and with recipes, they were a dime a dozen, and this might be one of those cases where that turn of phrase is literal, where a dime would get you a dozen different medical books. They were just so plentifully available, and that was in addition to friends sharing information about herbcraft. A guy came along named Samuel Thompson, and he is referred to as the father of modern herbalism by some, but really he was just a damn good capitalist. Beginning in the 1820s, Samuel Thompson began publishing his family vegetable medicine, and it became kind of a standard on the bookshelf for many European American settlers. He wasn't the first, he wasn't the best, but he was an aggressive marketer and he was successful. And an integral piece to his success was that in his books, which you can see, a copy of his book over here and a certificate on the left, he would sell each of his books new with a certificate for a Thompsonian physician in the back. So you would buy one of the books and you would rip out the back page and you would fill it out with your name, and suddenly you were a certified Thompsonian family vegetable medicine doctor. So he was just a really good at marketing, right? So this is an interesting thing too, because the divide that we see today with clinical medicine versus at-home medicine and the constant embattling between these two, those existed at the time. And what's interesting about Samuel Thompson is he represented the anti-establishment medicine of the time. Establishment medicine often prescribed mercury to induce vomiting. It bled people to align the humors. And the vegetable medicine oftentimes were done in opposition to what the ivory tower of medicine was doing at the time. So Samuel Thompson also became a public advocate for at-home medicine, which of course the ivory tower rejected. And there's a whole quite a few interesting legal battles involving Samuel Thompson because the clinical medical establishment didn't want more people to have access to more herbal remedies and information like this. It's something that we see this divide existing today as well. But medical books were everywhere. And these books were abundantly available. Thompson's books were just the most popular. They were the largest fish in an ocean full of fish. Medical books, journals, when they helped to undermine the medical establishment, the ivory tower, they became even more popular. So all of that is a bit of background on the state of medicine. And you may be sitting here saying, okay, this has been boring. I came here to learn about Joseph Smith using psychedelics. Why are we talking about all this? Well, this is just background information. How can this be useful? Well, it's magic and occult. Alex did a great job of introducing this in his presentation, and I have a couple of questions. Thank you. It's with large thanks to the pioneering research done by D. Michael Quinn in the 1980s in early Mormonism and the magic worldview that we have something to kind of refer to that illustrates the world of the 19th century occult and magical practitioners, of which Joseph Smith and the Smith family were very much steeped into that culture. So through numerous names of magic philosophers come up throughout early Mormonism and the magic worldview. Francis Barrett in the middle left here. He wrote the Magus. Alex referred to him earlier, the Magus or Celestial Intelligencer. We also have Henry Cornelius Agrippa. He wrote the 3-book Occult Philosophy. And then we have Ebenezer Sibley, who wrote A Key to Physic and the Occult Sciences. We're going to dive a little bit more into each of these. But each of these books and numerous magic artifacts that exist in the Smith family heritage are important for illustrating the world of magic practices and occultism at the time. D. Michael Quinn, however, didn't know much about psychedelics. He was a good believing Mormon his entire life. And in a conversation that I had with him during a Sunstone, he frankly said that he hadn't really considered it because knowing the world of psychedelics and knowing the world of 19th century magic, as well as 19th century medicine, as well as Smith history, it requires an interdisciplinary approach in order to weave this framework together to understand psychedelic Mormonism. And D. Michael Quinn just doesn't appear to have had that basis of information of familiarity with psychedelics. However, in 2007, a researcher came along by the name of Robert Beckstead, and he published Restoration of the Sacred Mushroom and presented it at Sunstone. And that kind of essentially became the blueprint for Cody and I to pick up and publish our self-published work that we published and presented at Sunstone in 2017. And needless to say, it's a very different world now. And when we consider the pioneering work that D. Michael Quinn did to look at the magic, as well as the pioneering work that Robert Beckstead did to put this together, specifically with Robert Beckstead, I'd like to think that he probably wouldn't think that a symposium on psychedelic Mormonism ever would have existed when he published that original paper. And I think that if he were looking down on us today and watching this, he'd be very pleased. And in fact, I know that he is looking down on us, and he told me that he is pleased about the symposium being here. So, but yes, Robert Beckstead, we owe a lot to him for pioneering this research and bringing in the idea that psychedelic Mormonism might actually have merit and laying the foundation, the blueprints here.
Here, here.
And there's a larger point to drive home here. Books that were specifically dedicated to vegetable medicine or herbal medicine, they were not the only source of information about plant medicines, and specifically about psychedelics. Popular books on occult philosophy, and Alex cited some of these earlier, talk all about how to use these herbs, how to use psychedelics, and the extraction methods for them, how to render them safe. Ebenezer Sibley's 1795 book, A Key to Physic and the Occult Sciences, it included color pictures of over 100 different herbs. So not only could you read his written description of what they looked like, you could turn to the back of the book, the appendix, and see a color picture. And for for the printing press at the time, having a book with color pictures in it was quite exotic. So other books, Francis Barrett's The Magus or Celestial Intelligencer, and Robert Smith's The Astrologer of the 19th Century. These are all quite popular books in the occult realm at the time. They included how all these plants can be used, and many of these plants can be used, how they can be used in ceremonial practices, in a spiritual setting for divination and for prophecy. Each of these occult philosophers, they also go extreme lengths to let their readers know that some of the plants can conjure hallucinations, auditory and visual hallucinations, conjure spirits, causing spirits to appear. They can cause a person to become suggestible, fall into a hypnotic trance, and you can basically control their actions. Prophecy and divination, as I mentioned earlier, and plenty of other just common occult practices at the time. And they even direct the user how to ingest the plant medicines, whether it's by anointing oil on parts of the body or covering the entire body with it, or whether it's drinking or it's eye drops or it's smoking, fumigations. They are explicit and tell exactly everything that we need to know for the psychedelic formula. So where the vegetable medicine books largely focus their entire works on herbcraft, and remedies and how to diagnose patients, occult books at the time, when they talk about herbs, oftentimes it's within the context of using them for spiritualistic or for warding or for talismanic type of magic. So, like something like Joseph Smith's Jupiter talisman. At various times in his life, he may have anointed it with a specific concoction of various plant chemicals, and he may have fumed, he may, heated up the talisman and caused it to smoke, or he may have just anointed it and used it as a protection. So these occult books tell us the formulas of the specific herbs we need in order to render the various plants to make them useful. I have a lot of quotes here. If you want quotes of like specific lines from these books, ask for it in the Q&A, but I'll skip ahead for now. So I do want to spend a little time talking about spirits, the idea of spirits, because it was a common view that a person's spirit was responsible for their health, and that's not something that's foreign to us today. But the idea that is, you have a good spirit, then you have good health. You have a bad spirit, then you have bad health, right? That makes sense. When a person would eat something and they would become sick afterwards, well, then it was understood that it was because they had eaten an evil spirit, or an evil spirit had possessed them, or something to that effect. Or they had sinned and allowed that evil spirit to come in. So bleeding was a common medical practice at the time. It actually shares its roots in the idea that you are bleeding out the bad blood that's tainted by an evil spirit and replacing it with good blood from a good spirit. So this idea of spirits, they live around us. They operate and influence everything around us. And spirits even living within the plants themselves. When we take those spirits into us, it causes our spirits to be influenced by whatever spirits are around that plant, especially when we're using these within the ceremonial or occult context. This is why it's so important to have mindset and the setting proper when you are partaking of the spirits of these plants, because if you do so in such a way that the spirits are displeased, then, well, you'll feel the wrath of the evil spirit. This is from Robert Smith in The Astrologer of the 19th Century. He tells us how prevalent spirits really are. He says, quote, "Many and different are the names of good and bad spirits, but their proper and true names, as those of the stars, are known only to God, who alone numbers the multitude of the stars and calls them by their names, whereof none can be known by us but by divine revelation." And then he explicitly talks about how spirits can be conjured or how they can be banished. He says, "The bonds by which these spirits are bound be sought or cast out are 3. Some of them are taken from the elemental world, as with the theurgist would adjure a spirit or conjure a spirit, inasmuch as we would call up or cast them out, as by fumigations of flowers, herbs, animals, snow, ice, or by fire, and the such like. He goes on to say, and these also are often mixed with divine praises and blessings and consecrations. So he's illustrating the importance of set and setting here when you are communing with these spirits, and he's specifically saying by fumigations of plants, herbs, as well as animals. Many of these occult recipes also include parts of animals, and they could have been literal parts of animals, or those parts of animals could have been used as code words for various herbs that only initiates and master herb crafts would understand what they're referring to. So essentially, if I'm just kind of translate the word vomit that I just gave you, Robert Smith says that once blessed and consecrated for the purpose, smoking flowers, herbs, or animals with burnt sacrifice, that can conjure or it can banish a spirit depending on the mindset of the person that's doing the ritual. And of course, this is influenced by the spirits around them, by the spirits of the participants in the ritual, as well as the ruling celestial bodies, ruling planets at the time. So in summary of this first section of the herb craft here, practitioners of ceremonial or spiritual magic, they needed familiarity with plant medicines to conduct these rituals. My entire presentation, it could just be reciting these recipes, but you're not here for that. So in an age before psychedelics were criminalized, magicians used these ceremonial among plenty of other plants and animal parts in order to achieve their ceremonial ritualistic goals. So let's talk about the logistics and supply now that we have kind of this background of the herb crafting. And we know how much herb craft as well as beer making was part of the family heritage with the Mack family as well as the Smith family. So it's not enough for us to say that herb craft was used in occult rituals and Joseph Smith was a practicing magician. Therefore, Joseph Smith knew herb craft and he was using psychedelics in the sacrament. We have to show our work. We need to establish lines of communication. We need to establish people that Joseph Smith learned from who had the herb crafting necessary and then taught it to Joseph Smith, his psychedelic mentors, if you will. The first one, of course, is Luman Walters, and this is somebody who figures heavily into early Mormon magic practices. He was one of Joseph's primary magic mentors, not just in herb crafting. He was noted as a root and herb physician, and he was branded with the label of eccentric witch doctor. He was well known after his affiliation with Joseph Smith and the Mormons for being a fortune teller, in addition to running his own apothecary, his own medicine shop. Of the hierarchy of the herb craft scale that I showed before, Luman Walters is up on the top of that. He had formal training as a physician in Europe, which was incredibly exotic at the time. And he had spent his life working with occult ritualism and herbal remedies. And after he was connected with Joseph Smith in the early 1820s, some people later remembered that he was connected with the early church. However, when Joseph and the Mormons moved out of New York to Ohio and Missouri, it appears that Luman Walters actually just remained in New York and continued running his apothecary shop until he died. Needless to say, this eccentric root and herb doctor, this is a primary candidate to teach Joseph Smith everything that he would need to know in order to produce a psychedelic sacrament for the early and visionary Mormons. Now, next, of course, we talk about Oliver Cowdery. Luman Walters wasn't the first herbal physician with close proximity to Joseph Smith, but he wasn't the only one. He was just merely the first in a long string of people who were always at Joseph Smith's side, who were herbal physicians. Oliver Cowdery, many will recognize that he was Joseph Smith's scribe for the majority of the Book of Mormon. He was also one of the prominent leaders of the church until he was excommunicated in 1838. Oliver descended from a long line of physicians. Some of his family were well-renowned physicians. They were well known for their curative processes. His brother, Warren, was also an herbal physician. And then we have Frederick G. Williams. And this is somebody I could spend I have spent entire presentations on this guy, but suffice it to say, this guy is paramount to psychedelic early Mormonism. And in more ways than just being able to provide the supplies for it. His entire name is Frederick Granger Williams, and he worked as Joseph Smith's second in command, essentially, well, third in command. When Joseph Smith had organized his presidency, he organized Sidney Rigdon as his first counselor and Frederick G. Williams as his second counselor. In the 1820s, Frederick G. Williams had lost a sister to an ailment of conventional medicine at the time, and he vowed from that day forward to learn herbal medicine and to become a physician. And he bought a copy of of Samuel Thompson's book, The Thompson Family Vegetable Medicine, and he filled out the certificate in the back, and suddenly he was a certified herbal physician. So more importantly, though, when Joseph Smith moved out to Ohio, even prior to Joseph moving out there, Frederick G. Williams was one of the first converts to the church who was living in Ohio. He joined with the first missionaries to preach to the Native Americans in Missouri, where he sent a letter back to his wife mentioning how much he was learning from the medicine men who were there in the villages that they were visiting. Importantly as well, he had an important plot in the town of Kirtland. He actually owned the plot that he consecrated to the church that part of the Kirtland Temple is built on. He also consecrated his entire medical, his herbal practice to the church as well. And when Williams was out of town, Joseph Smith Sr. actually took control running his farm. Notably as well, the first full-length expose of Mormonism, it's titled Mormonism Unveiled. It actually says explicitly that the word of wisdom actually came from this guy. Because the word of wisdom says every herb in the season thereof, of course, this herbal physician. He was labeled as a quack, and that's what the medical establishment did at the time, is label herbal physicians as quacks. Next we move on. An important point, this is going to tie in with a later presentation here, to illustrate how close Frederick G. Williams and Joseph Smith were to each other. Joseph and Emma chose to name one of their sons after Frederick G. Williams. Now, he's a person who, when you study church history, his name will come up occasionally, but very rarely is it fully understood how close he and the prophet were to each other. And I think Joseph choosing to name his second son after Frederick G. Williams is very important, and that's Frederick Granger Smith. And of course, Frederick Granger Williams here is also the namesake for the RLDS prophet Fred M. Smith, which Cody is going to talk about a bit more. So this guy is hugely important to the early visionary era of the church. So of course, after the move to Missouri and to Nauvoo, then we have this guy, John C. Bennett. Now, this is a very divisive figure in Mormon history for plenty of good reasons. He was a close confidant of Joseph Smith. He was also he was Joseph Smith's first in command after Sidney Rigdon fell out of favor. And Bennett was a practicing herbal physician, as well as was classically trained in obstetrics. So he was also alleged to have performed chemical as well as surgical abortions for the polygamy ring that was going on in Nauvoo. And it's important to understand that polygamy going on obviously caused a lot of medical issues. Frederick G. Williams had a salve that he labeled in his medical books as Bachelor's Delight. He didn't label what the recipe is, so we don't know exactly what its purpose was. But also, of course, the effects of polygamy are going to result in pregnancy. And somebody like John C. Bennett, who also ran a brothel in Nauvoo, he would have to have familiarity with various herbs as well as surgeries necessary to keep polygamy secret. Which leads us into our third point: the secrecy, the concealment, and of course the quorums. Now, I do not contend that psychedelics were used in every sacrament or every anointing ritual of the church. I believe that Joseph Smith was selective of times to use plant medicines in order to facilitate visionary experiences for the early Mormons. Joseph's theophany, I mean, this is legendary in Mormon circles, right? This is one of the first things you learn about when you invite the missionaries into your house. He was the only one in the woods at the time. There was nobody else around him who experienced the hallucination. However, in the first year of the church, a convert named Newell Knight, he had a really rough experience that he interpreted as a possession by evil spirits. Essentially what he did, Joseph Smith told him to go out in the woods and pray. And Newell did, because Newell wanted to receive a vision the same way that Joseph did. So Newell did go out into the woods, and he didn't see anything. Then he came home, and he began falling ill immediately. And he began to convulse and exhibit very typical symptoms of nightshade toxicity. Joseph Smith was called in to try and cast out the evil spirit, and Joseph Smith did what a good guide or a Shaw person does, a shaman, a Shaw person does. He grounded Newell. He tethered him. He brought him back into reality out of this extremely bad situation, and this is termed as the first miracle of the church. It was the exorcism of Newell Knight. Now, the number of people who experience the symptoms of toxicology as well as the visions begins to grow within the first years of the church. When we focus in on the very first years, we have what's known as the Morley Farm. Now, this is where psychedelic sacrament was initially held when Joseph moved the church out to Ohio. The Morley Farm, it was basically the Morleys were practicing communalism before the early Mormons were practicing communalism. So Isaac Morley had just a bunch of people living on his farm, and they shared all things in common, according to biblical teachings. So in this schoolhouse, this is where the trusted brethren would pull up together. They would put up blankets in the windows, in the doors. They would shut off all of the light. Then they would partake of the sacrament. And then they would have incredible visions and hallucinations. There's even a scant few records that claim that participants would lie in a trance for numerous days at a time from whatever was going on in the Morley schoolhouse. And notably as well, an herbal physician named J.J. Moss, who had, he was of the upper echelon of herbcraft. He had training as an herbal physician. J.J. Moss was living in Kirtland at the time. He heard what was going on here, and he's like, I'm going to go check in and see what's going on. So he did. He attended, and he explicitly said that he tried to steal one of the wine bottles to see if it was drugged or not. That's his words, not mine. But unfortunately, he was unsuccessful in stealing that wine bottle to test it to see if it did have psychedelics in it. But it's apparent that he, as well as his friend who went there, had symptoms of fine motor impairment and other symptoms that are common with nightshade toxicity. And the scenes from this are fascinating. This is a construction, and this is actually pulled full from our paper early, the Entheogenic Origins of Mormonism, a working hypothesis. We took a few sources and cobbled them together, but here it is. Quote, Joseph put his hands upon Harvey Whitlock and ordained him to the high priesthood. He, Whitlock, turned as black as Lyman was white, and while his fingers were set in claws, and he went around the room and showed his hands, and he tried to speak. His eyes were in the shape of oval O's. That reads to me as pupil dilation. His hands are seized up. These are fine motor impairment that's common with datura toxicity. Hiram Smith said, and there's a lot of other things going on at this time, and all of the men were getting very riled up at this time. And Hiram turned to his younger brother, Joseph, and he said, Joseph, this is not of God. Joseph said, do not speak against this. Joseph's brother was not convinced. And Hiram said, I will not believe unless you inquire of God, and he owns it. At this, Joseph bowed his head, and in a short time got up and commanded Satan to leave Harvey, laying his hands upon his head at the time. Then Lehman Copley, who weighed over 200 pounds, somersaulted in the air and fell on his back over a bench. Lyman White cast the Satan out of Copley, and Copley was calmed. The evil spirit, according to Hancock, was in and out of people all day and the greater part of the night. So there's just these things going on that we don't see common in other Christian practices at the time. These are things that are specific to the psychedelic Mormon experience, the visionary Mormon experience, and we posit the psychedelics are indeed responsible for this. As the church grew, more people expected visions and blessings. The visions and blessings of old are returning, I saw here. And Joseph Smith was expected to perform. He expanded the circle of participants who would receive the consecrated sacramental wine that was of Joseph's make, according to Revelation. So the school of prophets was created. And the School of Prophets, basically, what this amounted to was Joseph and a few dozen of the closest elders, the most trusted acolytes, hanging out in a dark room for hours and hours on end and smoking their pipes and sharing religious instruction. At the School of Prophets, Emma was so incensed by the mess that the men made up there that we actually got the word of wisdom out of it, because they were, spitting tobacco and then just emptying out their pipes on the floor. But as the years progressed, more men were invited into this School of the Prophets, and it appears that Joseph Smith became more bold about how many people he could facilitate a visionary experience for. And that leads to the dedication of the Kirtland Temple. After a 4-year construction process, the Kirtland Temple was complete. Joseph had promised the Mormons, since he had given the revelation to build the temple, that this was going to be the most epic visionary experience of their entire lives. Spiritual experience, I should say. That's a more fitting word. Thousands of people gathered. Barrels and barrels of consecrated wine were partaken of. And I use the term consecrated specifically because that's the terminology that was used in occult books at the time when you were infusing or consecrating a spirit into tinctures or into whatever. The Mormons saw John the Baptist walking through the pews. Some people saw the Savior. Some people thought the temple was on fire. Some people saw angels flying around the ceiling. It was just a wild, wild experience. In the weeks on either end of it as well, the brethren were meeting, and they were often having these very late night religious sessions that involved covering their bodies in anointing oil or covering their bodies in cinnamon-infused whiskey. And these parties go until 2 or 3 in the morning sometimes. This is just known as the most visionary, the epic of Mormon history. And it takes a sharp drop after that because debt, hostile takeovers, prominent sex scandal with one Fanny Alger resulted in Joseph Smith being exiled from Ohio and moving to Missouri. And it appears that Joseph Smith using psychedelics kind of sharply falls off at this time. He seems to have been just too busy causing the Civil War in the state of Missouri and, running his own armies and stuff. He doesn't have time for all that visionary stuff anymore. Once we get to Nauvoo, however, it appears that Joseph created opportunities for psychedelic use. He instated a system of hierarchy where he was surrounded by only the most trusted members of the church, of course, and these are concentric rings of trust. We have also the Relief Society being introduced here at about the same time as polygamy is being taught and practiced clandestinely. We have the endowment introduced here. We have the second anointing and the quorum of the anointed. And importantly, the endowment ritual that Joseph created included numerous opportunities to surreptitiously dose participants. There was the washing and the anointing ritual, which could have been used to dose people. And there was also some of the participants would eat of an unknown fruit. Some people think it's a date. We don't know exactly what the fruit was, but that could also be a vehicle for psychedelics as well. Joseph's journal in Nauvoo, it carries just hints between the lines that he was still paying attention to this. He says, quote, "I spent the day instructing them in the principles and order of the priesthood, attended to washings, anointings, and endowments, by which anyone is enabled to come up and abide in the presence of Elohim. As soon as they are prepared to receive and a proper place is prepared to communicate them, even to the weakest of the saints. Therefore, let the saints be diligent in building the temple." So that's an important quote because it includes all 3 pieces of the psychedelic formula. We have dose with the anointings, or the washings, anointings, and endowments. We have the set with the people wanting to be in the presence of Elohim, and we have the setting with mentioning that the temple is going to be the place because it had worked in Kirtland. It was the most visionary time. The completion of the Nauvoo temple certainly promised to be even more visionary than the Kirtland temple. Unfortunately, Joseph Smith died before that happened. So then, of course, we moved to Brigham Young. Brigham Young was many things. Interested in psychedelics and visionary experiences doesn't really appear to be one of them. He was busy building an empire. Just like Joseph Smith in Missouri, when you're occupied with colonizing area and land, you don't have a lot of time to sit down and trip with your friends. So Joseph's death really sounded the death knell for the end of visionary Mormonism. However, there is scant evidence that small groups still existed in Utah who were very much still using these things, but not doing so within the context of, the entire meetings of people experiencing these visionary hallucinations. So to conclude everything together, I know this is a lot of information, kind of disparate, but I do want to thank you all for kind of your patience and for coming to attend today. To summarize everything, psychedelics, they were well known in both medical and occult literature and culture at the time. Psychedelics weren't discovered in the 1940s. These things have always existed around us, and our foreparents experimented with these things long before they were even crawling or walking on 2 feet. When it comes to Joseph Smith specifically, he was a practicing magician, and he always had an herbal physician at his right-hand slot, always in his immediate circle, always in his closest and trusted acolytes. Some of these acolytes, like Frederick G. Williams, they were instrumental in the growth and the sustainability of the church as an organization, just as much as they were capable of supplying Joseph Smith with as many or as much of these plant materials as he needs for these practices. And necessary to explain, all of this is necessary to explain. This is the logistics and the supply of the psychedelic early Mormonism. And what's interesting too is Joseph Smith at some point recognized the need for secrecy. He held in tension this idea that members need to have personal revelation and they need to commune with angels and commune with deity themselves. But at the same time, he can be the only one who's communing with deity on behalf of the entire church. And there's just sorry. As the church grew, Joseph Smith appeared to realize that that this was not sustainable, that he couldn't provide a psychedelic sacrament for all the tens of thousands of Mormons that were joining his church as he got close to his death. He created these concentric rings because he was becoming more judicious about who could partake in these sacraments and participate in visionary Mormonism. And he created these rings throughout his entire 14-year ministry. But at the end of the day, his 14-year ministry was for the sole purpose of understanding the mysteries of the kingdom of God. And I think in this way, he actually was capable of communing with deity. If you would like to, like I said at the beginning, chase our sources, chase our footnotes, find more information, you can find everything in the publications there, or if you want to listen to it on the Naked Mormonism podcast, those are the episodes 34, 59, 60, and 186 through 188. And thank you all very much.
So what we're going to do now is we're going to have a little break for 5 minutes. So you can grab a drink, use the restroom, whatever you need to do. But while you're out, if you can think of some questions, we'll have a short Q&A for the first 2 speakers, which is specifically about Joseph Smith's psychedelic ancestry and then the psychedelic experiences during Joseph Smith. After we have that Q&A, we'll then continue what happened specifically after Joseph Smith, and then we'll talk about local resources. So we're at the halfway point right now. Let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll have a Q&A right after that.
Well, exercise is good for you. Excuse me.
All right, we'll be starting the Q&A in 1 minute. So if you want to find your seats, we'll start the Q&A in 1 minute from now. All right. Okay, we're going to kind of read the room if we like having a mic or we don't like having a mic. It kind of has consequences either way. No mic in the front. In the back, what do you say? Mic. Okay, all right. Let's see. If I get closer, is it still bad? How much we just shout? No? Yes. Yes? Okay, all right, shouting. Okay, here we go. Okay, so I also want to see from the crowd who feels comfortable like coming down to the end of the stairs to ask a question. Who wants to do it from their seat? What do we feel most comfortable about? Do we want to walk up and have a chance to ask a question? I think doing it from our seats is probably the easiest way. Okay. All right. So Alex, Bryce, can you come up here and we're going to ask questions to them. Again, this is not the finished thing. This is really a little more than the halfway point of the history here. We're talking about the pre-Joseph Smith and then during Joseph Smith's psychedelics. Post-Joseph Smith is coming later, so these are the people that ask the questions about that. Now, is there anyone that would like to start with a question? All right. Yes?
Cinnamon whiskey all over his body? What does that even mean?
Among other things. The question is cinnamon whiskey all over their bodies. What does this mean?
Yeah, so the School of the Prophets was termed as a religious instruction school, but as I described it, how it started out was just Joseph Smith and a bunch of his buddies getting together in the room and experimenting. They were experimenting with religious practices, and the endowment kind of came out in 1942. Did take some roots from what they were practicing in this School of the Prophets. And in School of the Prophets, they were washing each other's feet, they were anointing each other with anointing oils, as well as bathing whiskey as part of the cleansing ritual. And the whiskey had cinnamon used into it, and possibly other herbs.
So that's something.
They cite the Exodus, the formula for it's an Exodus, and then you're gonna add further things to it based on like your cultural practices and stuff.
Isn't it endearingly referred to as the fireball endowment? Okay, next question.
I am an ex-Mormon. I exited before I got into the whole temple and now thing. I'm curious if anybody here happens to know what the current temple endowment experience is like, and if there's any references to entheogenic. Like, how did it evolve? I guess I'm curious from entheogens into what's happening now. Entheogens.
So,
Sorry to interrupt, but maybe repeat.
Okay, yeah, the question is, how does all this work into the current endowment? What's going on in the current endowment? I have stated 3 of us haven't been through the current endowment session. I'm possible for obvious reasons. But, so we don't, I hard to speak to that a bit, but how did it go from being potentially part of the endowment to what the endowment is today?
Yeah, anybody's aware of that, how it's evolved or devolved or how we put it. but-
So the endowment as it was initially created by Joseph Smith was more of an initiation rite. It was going through the passion narrative. We have somewhere between 95 and 90% of the reconstructed today, but we don't have the totality. When Brigham Young took it over, when Brigham Young took over the church, he was not interested in inciting visions and blessings for a whole to return to the saints. He wasn't interested in people getting their own revelation because he was not president of the church, and if there was going to be revelation, it was going to be him. And the temple, once the Nauvoo temple is completed, basically it just becomes a house for living saints. And really, that just becomes kind of a form of function that Brigham Young was increasing the practice of living at the time, and that the temple initiation ritual basically created the religious license for the spread activity. It seems that in taking it over, the psychedelic usage completely flattens. So, and as far as the modern goes, it's evolved a bunch of times. It has references, but because the initial ceremony was created within the context of an occult ascendancy of this, but they have been done extracted.
Yeah, is there any evidence that Brigham Young did partake in psychedelics and that led to his conversion? And are there primary sources, journals and things like that, or like the early versions of DNC that talked about these kind of things? Or were they so aware that they needed to keep it secret that none of that, made it onto paper?
I mean, it's possible that Brigham Young would have used it when he was in the inner circle while Joseph was still alive.
Well, there's, we got Brigham tea out here, right? Ephedra.
I used that, it did too much.
Yeah, right. It could be the case. But in any case, though, Brigham himself doesn't appear to have been interested in it very much. And that, I think, comes from the lack of predictability. If you are practicing with a friend, you can tightly control the variables around you. You can tightly control things and help guide them through that experience. With a room full of people, those variables become far more vast, and you have to control a lot more things. Entire rooms or entire chapels full of people, suddenly it can become very unpredictable very quickly. Brigham Young didn't like unpredictability. Right, so he did like drinking, though. He drank a lot.
So we'll take one more question and then we need to get to the last lecture. Okay, right in the middle.
When we hear about the Turtle Temple dedication, we hear the same stories about angels and Jesus and all this stuff, tons of flame. But there are a lot of other things that happen apparently, like Samuel Smith throwing out wine on the floor. Are there reports of other kinds of visions that were just selectively left out? Like I read some more reference to people seeing a flying riverboat. You hear about that?
I haven't read that specifically. So with the current dedication, there's an amalgamation of Yeah, of many sources, a few of them, a very small number of them are contemporary, but many come from reminiscences later. And the temple dedication ceremony, as we've talked about in the papers, is a construction or a reconstruction of a bunch of those different temples. That account of flying riverboat, I have not read that one before. But there's a ton of other missionary experiences that happen outside of the temple as well that are not often discussed. Heber Kimball walking out of the School of the Prophets and seeing legions of soldiers inside. And the brethren, when they were practicing the School of the Prophets, standing up on a stump and preaching in Adonic and preaching to the eagles that they were hallucinating they existed in front of them. So there are plenty of visionary experiences that happen outside of the Kirtland temple as well. We just like to hold it up as an example because it's kind of the crescendo, the high point of psychedelic use, and it drops off.
And there are plenty of accounts of people who continued seeing visions after they left the temple. We just don't have records, or they didn't record necessarily what they were seeing. So there's likely a whole slew of visionary experiences that we either haven't found or aren't mentioned because they happened continuing after they've left the temple. So.
All right, so we're going to wrap up questions for now. Thank you, Alex and Bryce. So our next speaker is Cody Noconi. And Cody is an independent researcher and the author of the newly published book, The Psychedelic History of Mormonism, Magic, and Drugs. He's the co-author of several research papers, including the Entheogenic Origins of Mormonism, a working hypothesis, which, he wrote with Bryce, which was published in the Journal of Psychedelic Studies. He's also created several educational podcasts, most recently Roughly Stoned, which we host together, and which is focused specifically on this topic. So Cody will speak, and then we'll have a brief moment to introduce our next speakers. And Cody, time is yours.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for the wonderful two presentations before me. Everybody, I think we have people from all over the country here right now, and this is really okay. Oh, no, I mind the next one. I'm sorry. This is amazing to me that you're all here, and thank you for taking all of the time to travel here, to take time out of your day. The crew for sitting in a car with me for 13 hours yesterday. Just everybody, thank you. Thank you so much. One of the first questions I'm consistently asked while presenting the Smith-Entheogen theory is, what exactly happened after Joseph, and did his attitudes or practices continue in any way among the Mormons? Criminally summarizing a lot of history for those that may not know, in the chaos that ensued following Joseph's death, kind of like we briefly mentioned, splinter groups began to form. The main body of the church followed Brigham to Utah, Strangites to Beaver Island in Lake Michigan, and finally the RLDS Church of Christ, which followed Joseph's eldest surviving son, Joseph III. For reasons that are quite beyond the scope of this presentation, I believe that the psychedelic sacraments and entheogenic sessions that founded the church quietly died away into obscurity, while the religion attempted to survive its founder. It is Joseph III's son, Frederick M. Smith, who is named after Frederick G. Williams, like Bryce had mentioned, that I will be discussing today, and his interesting story, which I think best answers the question I'm often asked about psychedelics and Mormonism after Joseph's death. Also, quietly rewriting psychedelic history as the world knows it, but we'll get to that. Fred M., as he was commonly known, was born in 1874, which was a very interesting period in terms of the history of psychology, as this was just shortly after the establishment of experimental psychology, when the study of the mind began to be recognized as a more legitimate science. This also coincided with major advancements in fields like chemistry and biology, which led to the creation of some the first major pharmaceutical companies like Bayer. Scientists the world over, for perhaps the first time collectively in human history, had relatively easy access to an industry that could consistently supply a great number of reliable mind-altering drugs. Unsurprisingly, many psychologists of the day capitalized on this advantage and found a rather academic excuse to get high and talk about it with their colleagues. That's Of course, not to say that this hadn't been happening since like the dawn of man. This was just like the first time that it could happen at scale and with an ease at which they just skyrocketed exponentially. So one such early psychologist, famed William James, while commenting on experiences with nitrous oxide, made the brilliant and usually quoted observation that, and I just lost it. So sorry. Our normal waking consciousness, rational consciousness as we call it, is but one special type of consciousness. While ulst about it, parted from it by the filmiest of screens, there lie potential forms of consciousness entirely different. We may go through our life without suspecting their existence, but apply the requisite stimulus, and at a touch, they are there in all their completeness. No account of the universe in its totality can be final, which leaves these other forms of consciousness quite disregarded, unquote. As we will see shortly, much of Fred M's career was an attempt to explore and examine the validity or value of those forms of consciousness. I'm double fisting my stuff here, sorry. All right. Fred M was in a unique position in time, like I mentioned, being both a privileged academic, educated by some of the very interesting drug-loving psychologists, and also a devoted man of faith, heir to one of the first and most successful American religions. While he was attending his secondary education in the late 1980s and early 1900s, he was able to openly and legitimately study the mind with few social taboos or religious restrictions in regard to his studies and interests in altered states. Eventually, Fred M. began to reach the conclusion that states of religious ecstasy, or the second wind as it was sometimes referred to, was similar to, or in fact synonymous with, the Mormon conception of revelation. After receiving his master's degree from the University of Kansas and later a PhD in psychology from Clark University, Fred M. was perhaps more qualified than any person in the Mormon faith at the time, save perhaps his grandfather, Joseph Jr., to reasonably make that conclusion. It was during his early studies at the University of Kansas in 1909 that Fred M. first became introduced to indigenous American religious ceremonies involving peyote by fellow RLDS member Philip Cook and Chief Three Fingers of the Cheyenne Nation. It is currently unknown if Fred M. was familiar with peyote as an entheogenic vehicle prior to that time, as he fairly openly discusses this period in a way that seems innocently ignorant of his grandfather Joseph's possible connection to the cactus, via his most infamous peyote-shaped seer stone. While the peyote connection is speculation, Fred M. and Joseph Jr. did have remarkably similar philosophies when it came to psychoactive substances and revelatory states. Similar to his grandfather Joseph, Fred M. publicly denounced the use of intoxicating liquors, regarding them as mere poisons throughout his life. As researcher Shelby Barnes put it, quote, "Medical drugs, however, were different. In an article in the Herald of 1943, Smith discussed the need for the use of medicine which, in coordination with a physician's instruction, promoted healing. This may have been an important view to express, for there was an attitude among some saints that one needed only to rely on faith and prayer to be healed. Smith related the growing progress of the art of healing and the wider and deeper knowledge of the human body and its function." This view does indeed reflect that of his grandfather, Joseph Jr., over a half-century prior, when he said, Joseph Jr. speaking, quote, "I spoke at great length of the use of liquors and showed that it was unnecessary and operates as a poison in the stomach, and that roots and herbs can be found to effect all necessary purposes." If that was too old-timey jargon for you, that was Joseph Smith saying that you don't need to use liquors because you can get high with other things. Furthermore, when speaking on the famous word of wisdom, Joseph said, quote, "All wholesome herbs God hath ordained for the constitution, nature, and use of man. Every herb in the season thereof, and every fruit in the season thereof. All these are to be used with prudence and thanksgiving. All grain is good for the use of man, and also the fruit of the vine, that which yieldeth fruit, whether it is in the ground or above the ground," unquote. So while the word of wisdom is today used as a means to enforce temperance among its parishioners, it nevertheless holds a lot of wiggle room in terms of psychoactive material, so long as one is utilizing them entheogenically. At least, that's my opinion. Barley drinks and wine of your own make additionally make a number of lightly alcoholic carrier substances for psychedelic plants and fungi, as Alex expertly spoke. I'm taking time to highlight this, that not only did Joseph and Fred M's views compare favorably with one another, but that Fred M was not breaking with any tradition thus far held within his branch of Mormonism. Regardless of whether or not this entheogenic tradition has been handed down in a familial line or was it the average consensus of the RLDS members, Fred's studies were an aim to find the science within revelation and make it scientifically repeatable. Plants, cactus, and fungi utilized with an eye to God, or in other words, for the betterment of a relationship to God, are still and always were technically permissible within the traditional Mormon worldview. Fred was introduced to the peyote ceremony verifiably as early as 1909, though so far it seems that he did not engage with it personally until at least 1913. Friend and fellow RLDS missionary Hubert Case eventually joined Fred in their first peyote ceremony, and it apparently didn't take much arm twisting, as Fred only had to suggest, quote, "I say, Hubert, the only way we will know is to eat of some and note its effects. I suggest we try it." Then they went on a peyote ceremony. This was apparently so powerful for him because not soon after, in 1914, less than a year later, when Fred was admitted to Clark University, and he expressed an interest in the study of ecstatic states and their history within religious ceremony, he was quickly persuaded by the president of the college, renowned psychologist G. Stanley Hall, to change his course of study from philosophy and economics to that of psychology, and he even offered to become his advisor. So before I get too far ahead of myself, I should mention once more that in addition to Fred M's rather sterling academic credentials, he was the paternal grandson of Joseph Smith Jr., and as I've already mentioned, prophetic heir to a rather sizable portion of the Mormon population. In fact, furthermore highlighting the impact his peyote experiences must have had on him the year prior, Fred M. began preaching sermons at the headquarters for the RLDS Stone Church regarding the peyote ceremonies and their relationship to the Mormon ones. While he was not out of the psychedelic closet, so to speak, and he did not admit to consuming peyote himself in these ceremonies, it is noteworthy that he began respectfully and tactfully advocating these ceremonies shortly after his own initial experiences. Although he did not reveal his personal experiences, Fred was at times quite candid about the ceremonies with his Mormon congregation. For example, Fred related, quote, "Each worshiper is expected to roll a cigarette and solemnly smoke at least 4 puffs. After each has been smoked, the first of the peyote is eaten. Each person is handed 2 or more, depending on the quantity on hand, of the herbs, and these are solemnly eaten. After the first general eating of peyote, the number consumed is left to the individual's inclination, the user securing by request from the chief the number desired," unquote. It is during this time that Fred M. was pursuing his PhD and exploring/advocating for peyote ceremonies that his father, Joseph Smith III, was in progressively failing health. And as such, Fred was subject to an increasing pressure and amount of responsibilities in leading the reorganization. Shortly after the death of Joseph III in 1915, Fred M. was appointed the prophet president of the reorganization, or RLDS. I can only imagine the stress involved in working towards a PhD, and my mind begins to reel at the concept of doing that whilst also running a large portion of the Mormon faith. It's understandable that in an attempt to explain his like huge range of interests and why he was so interested in revelation, researcher Shelby Barnes observed that, quote, "He, being Fred, was vitally concerned with the possibility of man revealing the mind of God, and if so, how? The expectation of his office concerned him, for he questioned his own ability to give revelation to the reorganization. And unlike most other presidents of the reorganization, in presenting his inspired documents to the church, he did so more in a detached manner. From his studies, he was convinced that every human being had the potential to expand the limits of his or her mind. To what degree this could be done and how best to do it were questions which remained for him to address. It was a personal quest for Smith, but it was also a quest which was now conducted within the larger community of the church. He was concerned with how he might encourage others to expand their minds beyond the limits they knew, to stretch, to grow, to further experience ecstasy. All of this is culminating in the early years of World War I, if that helps give you a better reference. And coincidence or not, this reflected the attitudes of his grandfather Joseph in terms of altered states, plant medicines, and the tolerance or even encouragement of their employment. Fred M. referred to revelation or religious ecstasy, a power he believed was accessible to all of God's children, as, quote, calling into action the higher powers of man. He adapted this for the title of his 1917 doctoral thesis, The Higher Powers of Man. In this doctoral thesis, Fred devotes a considerable portion to responding to and expanding the work of the renowned psychiatrist William James, whom I cited at the top of the page, the filmiest of screens guy. This is, additionally, Fred penned a rather lengthy chapter exhaustively detailing the various types and degrees of ecstasy. The most interesting section of this book, however, is an early but detailed description of the indigenous American peyote religions. And this is where I need to take a quick side note, tangent about the uncomfortable aspects of this thesis and Fred M.'s work. Perhaps, Fred M. was subject to what I like to call grandpa racism. Perhaps well-intentioned comments that are made in absolutely the worst way. I'm going to forego giving you a lot of the worst ones, but it's weird how he's advocating for the rights of indigenous communities while also speaking about them in a casual and belittling manner that's very racist adjacent at the same time. So while I do find Fred a fascinating subject and the higher powers of man to be criminally ignored among general Mormons and ex-Mormons alike, I do feel obligated to take a moment to highlight the problematic language and sections of that work, acknowledging that Fred M. clearly had his blind spots, especially while studying the indigenous communities he built relationships with. That said, I believe he nonetheless recognized the value and importance of those indigenous communities and what an emphasis they placed on altered states or religious ecstasy. His study of this was what appears an attempt to answer how his own ancestors approached and attempted to access religious ecstasy. While Fred's language and writing is not ideal, often subject to the casual racism against indigenous peoples common of that period and today for that matter, he did both recognize the value of peyote and indigenous communities and how they built a ceremony around the cacti. And it appears that he was even well received among the communities he was taking ceremony with. So just to reiterate, a lot that I threw at you, we have Fred M. Smith in 1918, a president, prophet of the RLDS Mormons, paternal grandson of Mormonism's founder, Joseph Smith Jr., who's also a PhD in psychology from Clark University under the advisory of prestigious psychologists like G. Stanley Hall and William James, publishing a book on the cutting edge of exploring altered states at a time in which he devotes a lengthy chapter promoting the entheogenic employment of peyote among the indigenous Americans, and finally, an open advocate of those ceremonies as a means of reliably reaching religious ecstasy or the higher powers of man. As much as we get into speculation about the career of Joseph Smith Jr., there is no ambiguity when it comes to Fred M. Smith. As if this weren't interesting enough, Fred M. wasn't finished in the realms of consciousness and psychedelia. In 1918, Fred had introduced his wife Ruth to the peyote ceremonies while on holiday together. He seems to have maintained a steady attendance of these ceremonies, as Shelby relates that he participated in at least another 4 ceremonies over the next year. During several of these sessions, Fred was apparently allowed to give sermons or presentations on the similarities between the Mormon God, as he perceived it, and that of the indigenous communities. It does not appear that he was doing so in an act of proselytization, but rather solidarity, an act of bringing those two communities together. Aside from introducing his wife to the peyote ceremonies, Fred also began inviting an inner circle of like-minded RLDS friends to join him in peyote sessions with the Omaha, where they, quote, all drank a concoction made of boiling peyote. Although he preached several sermons on the matter at Stone Church and maintained a small group of friends and family with which he shared his experience, after the first few sermons and articles were published, it appears the promotion of ecstatic states and peyote ceremonies kind of died down. Whether from internal pressure from the more temperate church members, feeling as though his advocacy was falling on deaf ears, or some other reason, it is not currently clear. Despite tempering his public sentiments among his fellow Mormons, Fred M. maintained his attendance at peyote ceremonies and even gained some access to a supplier, as he sent some of the cactus to his daughter at one point to try for herself. He additionally maintained a relationship with this supplier, as we will soon see. As a side note here, Fred's daughter Alice didn't seem to be big on the peyote thing. She allegedly tried them with little effect. It should be noted that she likely did this under her own experimentation, as Fred mailed them to her, and so her dose setting may not have been as statistically reliable as the sessions Fred was experiencing among the indigenous communities he took ceremony with. Sometime around the period that Fred M. sent his daughter Alice peyote buttons to experiment with, Alice began bringing around a college friend, future composer and music critic, artist, intellectual. He wrote for the New York Times, Virgil Thompson, looking rather terrifying and like Hitchcock right there. Fred M. and Virgil hit it off immediately, as not only did the artistic intellectual continue making visits to the Smith home, but was eventually offered peyote buttons by Fred. Fred M. told Virgil to take them before bed and to make a detailed report afterward to Smith. Virgil must have also had a very powerful first experience, as upon returning to college at Harvard University, he began spreading the peyote experience among his fellow students, all seemingly provided by Fred M. Smith, a sitting Mormon prophet, if I need to keep saying it. Author Albert Pike details the spread of peyote among the Harvard aesthetics, which was the group he was working with, a group of artistically inclined Harvard students who were being led by Virgil Thompson. This group also seems to have found the experience beneficial, as they in turn began to spread peyote to Europe, particularly to their friends in France, apparently all or in part supplied by Fred M. This group helped later inspire the beatnik movement, as well as another group of more infamous psychonauts at Harvard, the Harvard Psilocybin Project. The so-called birth of the psychedelic renaissance, which officially occurred in the early 1950s and 60s, was led by infamous Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, who created the Harvard Psilocybin Project in order to better study the effects of mind-altering drugs among a small group of artists and intellectuals at Harvard University. This group helped promote and provide access to LSD and psilocybin throughout the country, which in part led to the hippie movement and the Summer of Love. What remains unexplored in the scope of psychedelic history is how the Harvard Psilocybin Project was the second generation of psychonauts at the university, and were themselves inspired by the Harvard aesthetics of the 1920s over a generation prior. Furthermore, how the reputation of Fred M. Smith seems to have additionally inspired the birth of the 1960s as we know them. One of the more famous experiments made under the supervision of the Harvard Psilocybin Project is the Good Friday experiment, otherwise known as the Miracle at Marsh Chapel. This experiment was conducted by Harvard Divinity School graduate Walter Pank under the supervision of Timothy Leary. This experiment not only laid the groundwork for most of the study of psychedelics as a beneficial entheogenic agent, but appears to have been in part inspired by the work and writings of Fred M. Smith. Walter Pank created a sort of checklist for the experiment in order to better evaluate and categorize the varied experiences and progressive phases of religiously ecstatic states. And coincidentally or not, Fred M. published a very similar checklist describing the exact same thing in his book, The Higher Powers of Man, half a century prior. After comparing the two checklists and considering Fred M.'s reputation among the psychonautic artists, psychologists and theologians at Harvard, not to mention that Fred M. was only one of a handful of published authors on the subject at that time, it seems quite likely to me that Walter Pank was familiar with Fred's work and perhaps even updated Fred's checklist for ecstatic experiences in order to design the Good Friday experiment. Admittedly speculative, and of course correlation does not mean causation, but I do believe a tangible connection is there. And it is my hope that this presentation will inspire further research into this area and perhaps shed more light on the influence Mormon leaders had on the birth of the psychedelic movement as we currently understand it. Though his impressive academic credentials and forward-thinking approach to religion and personal revelation deserved much more attention, it appears that due to his position within the RLDS Church, Fred's advocacy for peyote and altered states remained a quietly circulated curiosity within his publications, remaining largely unread or ignored by RLDS church members. Unfortunately for the field of psychology and psychedelic research, due to the political struggles within the various offshoot branches of the Mormon faith, including his own, Frederick chose to devote more of his time to managing the church and began to more and more neglect his studies of deeper consciousness after the 1920s. Despite this, he remained a quiet user and more private advocate of entheogenic ceremonies. It appears that he even aided in petitioning for the rights of peyote religion and the Native American Church in Washington, D.C. with several of his RLDS associates. While this is noteworthy, he seems to have done this more as like a prominent and respected citizen rather than in any official capacity or like that of a prophet. The story of Fred M. is fascinating, and unlike his grandfather, like I mentioned, Joseph Smith, it is completely unambiguous. While more work and research is obviously needed in this area to better solidify and publicize this part of history, it is a solid cornerstone with which to approach the subject of not only Mormon history of psychedelics and entheogenic sessions, but that of psychedelic and scientific history in general. That's it for me tonight. Thank you very much for your time, everyone. Stay safe. Should we do? You want to do we have time?
I think we'll do a Q&A after Melinda and Jude.
Okay.
All right.
That was awesome, wasn't it?
All right. So what we're going to do, we're going to transition a little bit now. Now that we talked about the Mormon history of psychedelics, pre-Joseph Smith, during Joseph Smith, and post-Joseph Smith, what we're going to talk about is resources and in the Salt Lake City community itself. So we're going to hear from two people now. We're going to hear from Miranda Bowen and her friend Jude. Jude, what's your last name? I missed it. What is it, Higgins? Okay, Jude Higgins. And I'll give you a little bit of an intro of Miranda. And so Miranda is a registered nurse with a background in oncology, hematology, and chemotherapeutics. And so with her husband and 3 children, she created Natural Law Apothecary, which is a 3,000 square foot brick and mortar establishment in the heart of Salt Lake City. It's only 7 minutes from here. And it offers integration experiences, ritual, and ancient medicine from around the world. We spent a good portion of the day this morning there. It was a pleasure. It's not going to be there forever. It's moving to a new location, so get there while you can. The new location is going to be awesome too, but it was a great experience being there. And so, and Jude, I would love to hear your bio too. I don't have it on my phone, so if you give your little bio when you speak, but I'm going to turn it over to Miranda, and then Jude will speak, and then we will have a Q&A for the group to wrap us up with the final 15 minutes or so. All right, Miranda.
Presentation. Oh, thank you. Thank you to the researchers and the organizers of this event. I was so pleased and tickled to be able to be included. I have had this apothecary here for 10 years now, and we are right down the street on 600 West, and we will be there until the first week in June. And I would love for anybody to come and see us as we offer an amazing space for knowledge, to learn about plant medicines and to see them. We have a working medicinal garden there that is very beautiful this time of year. And it is actually there that I met my dear friend Jude, and I would actually love for her to begin this with introducing you to some of the basics that are part of the integration resource ideas. And then I will talk more specifically about actual places that you can go to learn about, here in Salt Lake City. So Jude, would you come up and introduce yourself and then go into your point? And I apologize, you've got me here, but is it okay to go to hers and then back? Awesome. Thank you. Arrow on the right. Bottom right. You got it. And then I'll just go backwards. Thank you so much.
Thanks. My name is Jude Higgins. Thank you for having me here. I'm a psychedelic chaplain as well as an end-of-life doula. So I work at the Divine Assembly Church here in Salt Lake and at Lotus Wholeness and Healing Clinic. And I'm just going to talk about the work before the work. So beginning your psychedelic journey, it's important, well, first off, to talk about responsible medicine use. It's all about responding. That's all it means. Are you responding to what the medicine is telling you? What's happening relative to the response outside yourself? What's happening internally? So that's what is meant when people say practice responsible medicine use. So just respond. So when we talk about initiation work, and Miranda will talk about integration work, we're thinking about the resources that we have to help us and guide us and support us as we begin our journey into medicine work. You can generate a resource list. As you do that, bringing awareness to your body and your mind and how that feels inside as you're generating that list. What is your somatic response? Usually people relax and feel more supported as they generate their lists. So the act of listing your supporting resources, that's what turns into your reliable and comforting network system to support you as you begin your journey. You can turn these lists into collages, mandalas, any type of art. You can use that art as you journey. But think about your resources as a blueprint for your network of support, and make connections and speak to your allies about the process you're going through. So there are 3 basic resources that we talk about or identify when we start medicine work: your internal resources, your external resources, and your transpersonal resources. If we're talking about internal resources, we're talking about internal aspects of your own self that help you in that work. Do you have a good sense of humor? Do you have healthy self-esteem? Do you have aspects of self-compassion that are strong? And do you feel a strong sense of purpose? So you can list down all of your internal resources. These are just a few. And then if you want, make a collage card. Use that collage card as you begin your journey. External resources are aspects of your support system that are outside yourself. Your friends, your family, certain communities that you might belong to, various clubs, alliances. It could be something in nature. It could be your favorite tree or your favorite stream. It could be your pet. All of these will interweave. You'll see that. Transpersonal resources. Those things might include aspects of ritual, prayer, ceremony, meditation. Before anyone begins a journey, I work at a ketamine clinic, and before anyone begins their journey, we do a grounding meditation and to start. So that's part of a transpersonal resource. It can be energetic, spiritual, archetypal, imaginal. It could be your higher self, the divine, Gaia, Pachamama, Mother Nature, any of your personal ancestors, animal companions that are in our non-ordinary reality. Many individuals will find animal companions on their psychedelic experiences. And then spirits, guides, guardians, all of those transpersonal resources. Again, as those resources are listed, what happens typically somatically is that people naturally relax. And you're better prepared for the psychedelic work because you do feel so supported. And that's it. Thanks.
I'll get back to
You're so sweet to take me back to that.
Yeah.
I appreciate you allowing me to put Jude in that space there. And I feel like it's very representative because oftentimes we don't think about integration until we're there at that point, and we need to go back and do the work before the work later. And in a space in which set and setting was made mention, a lot of the work before the work is actually beginning then. It's beginning in those spaces where it's held. And when we participate in ceremonial plant medicine, or even animals, as it was mentioned that those are sometimes even a part of the ecstatic experience, we don't have the opportunity to fully integrate because we don't have resources available to us in the same way that they might have been when they were in a container when they were held. So as Jude was speaking about those very special relationships with self, relationships with your community, relationships in the beyond, those are part of your integrative process that you want to begin an awareness of, a cultivating of, so that when you come to the time to bring things back into wholeness, and integration means that, it means to bring it back into wholeness, you're going to be pulling all of those resources of that initiatory space of that work before the work. And so I wanted to make sure that I sent you off with some very tangible places you can go, both physically as well as in the social media universe, to find sustenance, to find conversations that you might not be able to have in your professional community or your immediate community. And those integration resources begin with one of my favorite and first resources that I found, and that's the University of Utah Psychedelic Science Interest Group. How many of you here are already a part of that, if I ask by a raise of hand? Well, I'm so glad that I can share this resource with you because this is amazing. It is completely free. You simply join through that email there, mention that you would like to become a part of the group. They have been meeting in person for 5 years with a break during the COVID time, and then they reinitiated that so that they were able to meet online via Zoom meetings. And just recently, they began meeting in person again. So this is a place that you can physically go, have conversations about entheogens, about psychedelics, about plant medicine, about integration, about resources, about the psychedelic practices and studies that are happening right now here in Utah. The next place I put on there was Jude. I think Jude is an incredible resource. I want you to understand that the conversation of death, the language of death, is really so closely bridged with ego death. When I believe it was Bryce who mentioned, oh no, it was Alex who talked about the death in the families and how closely that brings us into these experiences. And there's very much a resonance there. And so having an opportunity to speak with a psychedelic chaplain, somebody who has had experiences around death, birth, rebirth, I think is very important to these experiences. The Divine Assembly, how many of you are members or attend Divine Assembly? That's great. It's beginning to become a great resource here. The Divine Assembly is a psilocybin church, fully above ground here in Salt Lake City. They meet every Sunday at the New Yorker. It is completely free to go. It's 11 a.m. on 60 West Market Street. There is integration held there. There is networking held there. There is conversations on grow, on finding safe sacrament. They're growing that community very thoughtfully, putting in a lot of boundaries and trying to create safe spaces, but also very happy and joyful spaces. They have a huge festival coming up in June. And while that may be something that does cost, like I said, those Sunday meetings are completely free. And it is always open to anybody to attend those at 11 a.m. The Mormons on Mushrooms podcasts have been a very favorite of mine for when I want to have personal conversations, really just with myself, but also to hear the conversations of others. Mormons on Mushrooms, as well as Third Wave is here. That is another incredible place. They have conversations, podcasts, and full slides of how to safely work in this space. They talk about many different plant medicines. You can get pure and authentic, true, even dosage information and preparation information there. That Fireside Project is like a lifeline when you are having an entheogenic or a psychedelic experience and you need assistance. You simply text or call 62 Fireside and you will get assistance there. I skipped over Chacruna Institute. I want to come back to them. Chacruna Institute is online for legal information. For people who are in a quandary professionally and need legal information, Chacruna Institute is a great resource. They recently just put out the DEA's report on ayahuasca that greatly affects the plant medicine community. I would encourage you to go and check out Chacruna Institute. They also published an incredible report on searches, raids, and seizures of just normal people getting plant medicine during COVID. A lot of things were shipped, and a lot of people had visits from Homeland Security as well as local law enforcement. And that they do a great job of explaining that. And then also I want to make sure that I mention Numinous Health and the Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers podcast. Numinous is definitely rising star. They are reaching out into communities. They have been offering psychedelic medicine, mainly psycholytic, and then also in the form of ketamine and in psychedelic dosing. They are doing an incredible amount of studies in as they acquired Cedar Psychiatry, who has been working in the sphere of LSD and has working studies that they are doing right now here in Utah. And the Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers podcast has grown out of that space and is shared through that space and answers many questions that you may have about your own personal journey. I think that it is an incredible resource, and almost everything on this list is free. I put myself down there at the bottom. I want you to know that Natural Law Apothecary, it is our privilege to serve the plant medicine community. We want you to always see us as a resource to come and see these things in action. Many of the things have been removed from my apothecary in the last year due to attention that we personally received from Homeland Security, but we understood what was necessary in order to preserve ourselves and continue in that space and continue to share wisdom and knowledge. And we are happy to be a resource for you. And I am so grateful for the presenters for featuring me and spending time with me and spending time down at the apothecary and sharing our message of love and consciousness and support. And I appreciate all of you who came out tonight to support the wonderful organizers and researchers of this event. And thank you for your time here and for listening to me.
All right, we have a couple things, announcements at the end, and also just a huge amount of thank yous. Miranda was the one that introduced us to this space, Industry Salt Lake, and so they really helped us out to have an amazing venue for this event tonight. And so a huge thank you to Industry Salt Lake for helping us have a space to even hold our event. And thank you to all of you for attending. This is a great turnout. We had no idea what to expect. We knew that there were 25 people that had purchased tickets or made a donation in advance, but far more than that showed up. So it's like very supportive to us to see that there was appetite for this discussion. And we hope to have more of this in the future, be it virtual or in person like this. And we passed around a sign-up sheet if you want to keep in contact about future events like this. How far did it make it? How far did the... Oh, we made it all the way around. Oh, wow. Right when I'm saying it, the last person signing it. All right. Thank you for attending. And obviously the speakers and all the research that went into this. This was a massive project to pull this off. Bryce coming in from the East Coast just for this event. And Cody driving with the crew that's filming this 13 hours yesterday from Portland. And Alex coming all the way from Salt Lake. Thank you so much for this awesome presentation. And also thank you to the crew, okay? So the crew that's filming this right now and doing the audio, they've been with us all day, okay? The crew, almost all of them with the exception of Chad, drove from Portland yesterday with Cody. And so it was a lot of equipment in the car. It was a lot of adults in the car. And so that's a tough trip to make, but they did it. And then we shot all day on the documentary and then had this tonight. So thank you so much to the crew. And then now also, thank you. We had huge help from Amanda and Matthew, who volunteered to welcome you at the doors. We had a phone call, some email conversations with them, and like, what can we do to help? And it's like, well, you can greet people at the door. It ended up being super duper helpful, and thank you so much for helping with the and so a couple of announcements on top of this. So we are going to have a Q&A for a few minutes now. We need to wrap at 9 o'clock. Just get out of the space completely by 9:30. We got to get all our equipment out. So we're going to have a hard stop at 9. However, it's optional that the evening ends at that time because we are going to go to Temple and Family Brewing, or TF Brewing, however you want to call it. It's about half a mile from here, and we're just going to have a casual hangout where we can meet each other. You can ask more private questions about the research that you may not want to ask in front of the whole crowd. So that option is available. Now, so that's TF Brewing. That will probably, the crew will probably be there closer to 10, I'd say maybe 9:45. But if you want to start forming a group going there, please feel free, and we can have some private conversation there and just network.
Also, please be gracious because they don't know we're coming. So just be nice. It's a wonderful surprise.
Yeah. Okay, so we're having that tonight. If you have other plans, we totally get it. If you don't want to hang out, we have one more option. Is that tomorrow we're filming the documentary interviews at an awesome place. It's called the Gilgal Garden. Okay. So we're going to be filming interviews there, but then we have a 2-hour break in the middle of the day from 12 to 2. So what we're planning is just kind of, I don't know, maybe it is kind of a potluck, but we're not expecting, we're not going to be providing food. We're also not going to eat. We're not expecting you to bring food, but it's lunchtime. And so come prepared, eat before. Oh man, they're embarrassed that I said that. We're not asking to be fed. I'm sorry. But I just don't want you to be hungry because it's lunchtime. So just come prepared. Okay, so 12 to 2 at the Gilgal Garden. We're just going to have a hangout. Okay. Now, we may do, if you're interested, some impromptu interviews on the spot, which is casual people to get their feel of what's this idea of Joseph Smith using psychedelics. Just 2 basic questions that we may ask people to do on camera. We have release forms where you can sign to let your permission to be used in the documentary that we're filming. So it's all on the up and up. That's one thing that's happening at the Gilgal Garden tomorrow from 12 to 2. And then the last thing, okay, this documentary thing. Hey, so we kicked off a documentary. We've got some fabulous footage today, some really great interviews. It's organizing all the information that you're basically hearing today. And so we probably will have enough to make a 20 to 30 minute documentary after this weekend, but we have a bigger goal of making a full-length documentary. And so, but in order to do so, there are a couple things that we need help with. And so either if you personally in the room are interested in this, or if you have connections, we would love to know. And that is, we specifically are looking for an animator. They can help us just create some visual aesthetic to the documentary, someone that has animation experience. And we're also naturally looking for some funding. Now we have enough to fund ourselves for that basic documentary, but if we want to make it a fabulous documentary, we need a little bit of help. So if you're interested, or have connections to anybody that might be interested in making this a big scale educational piece, please talk to us. probably at the brewery, or you pull us aside if you have a chance to talk to us before you leave. Happy to have a conversation about that. So that's what's going on with the documentary. Animator and funding are the two things we're looking for. And now with the remaining time, we got 20 minutes. That's good. And I want to give you the option too. If you don't want to stick around for the Q&A, please feel free to leave. No offense. It has been a long show tonight. It's totally cool. Somebody, what's that? You'll be offended? Okay. All right. So it'll greet you with a fist at the door when he leaves. All right. That's too strong. We are going to have a Q&A now. We're going to invite everybody back up to the front, and then you can ask your questions. We've got 20 minutes. I'm sorry, we're probably not going to be able to answer all of them, but let's give it a shot to see what we can do. So, crew, speakers, let's come up to the top and see how we do. Just a quick reminder of where we've been. Do you want to come up to for resources, or I think you're going to have questions about that as well. So, Joseph Smith, Joseph Smith, and then Salt Lake Resources. That's what we're looking at for questions for this. All right, first question over here.
Are there any more back links to Barrett and Agrippa besides like the Jupiter thing?
Magic parchments. So are there any connections to Barrett and Agrippa aside from just the Jupiter talisman? The parchments themselves, the magic layman, as well as the ceremonial knife that went along with the parchments, those harken to one of those sources as well.
Okay, where were those like found? Were they just part of Joseph Smith's?
They were actually handed down to descendants of Hiram, who remained here in the Salt Lake City tradition, and they essentially just went kind of off of researchers' radar until B. Michael Quinn was able to locate the custodian of them, who gave Quinn permission to take copies of pictures of them and publish them in the early Mormonism book.
Thank you.
All right, questions?
Has Utah legislature made any answers or any topics? Decriminalization.
So the decriminalization movement in Utah has been led for many years by Dimitri Vallejos. And there was a surge when Matthew Butler and Valerie joined the team last year. Valerie had done a lot of work with maps. She had incredible knowledge base. And Matthew was a longtime veteran. I feel like he was a Marine or Green Beret. I forget exactly what he had done, but he had an incredible story. And they were quite a powerhouse and had made a lot of gains with the decriminalized nature movement. Unfortunately, it seems that there was not unity in the way that they all wanted to go with that conversation. And there was a stronger movement in some of the other psychedelic spaces, particularly in the religious community and the academic community. And so I feel that because they saw some of the imbalances there in the power and had personal feelings about which way they each wanted to support that community, it seems that that has taken a step back and is really waiting, I think, for possibly a new kind of leadership. So I would continue, if you have interest in that decriminalized nature conversation, to look for some of the larger agencies, because I don't know that they are having enough community outreach right now in order to support something locally at the Salt Lake level.
Kind of two main questions. One of them, when you're talking about something like the Kirtland Temple and you're having a large number of people dose at the same time, possibly, I was wondering if there's any stories or first-hand accounts, maybe from journals or something, about people going to a service and then they're not knowing or maybe knowing what's happening, but they're having some kind of first-hand experience of this is what I saw, or I had this really weird thing that happened, or like my son vomited for 4 hours straight type of thing. Or like medical records from the area for things like you are dosing people and grandma with heart problems is suddenly like in the hospital. Is there anything around those kinds that matches up?
I'm aware of a few accounts around the Kirtland Temple's dedication, not anything I could like quote off the top of my head. I do know that there was a type of kind of self-regulating dose response among the congregation where participants were encouraged to take as much as they like, which for reasons has a kind of social effect on how much people are ingesting. I would probably see parents maybe not letting their 4-year-old drink too much wine, just as an example. But yeah, that's, anybody else?
I have a thought on that, and maybe you can support it, and I'm sorry, I'm not the researcher, so I don't say that it's coming right now. But wasn't the Kirtland Temple very divisive in the sense that after this experience, a lot of people were not okay with what happened and were not interested in Mormonism, and that includes people from the community that thought that this was just outrageous. Is this correct to say?
So there's, in following 1836, quite a few things are set in motion. The debt from the temple crushes the Mormons. Martin Harris stands up in one of the meetings, immediately after or not immediately, but within weeks after the temple was dedicated, and says that he only viewed the place with a spiritual eye, and that causes a lot of people to lose faith in one of the witnesses. And a hostile takeover. The Perishites came in and actually started a brawl with this and doing things, and had a hostile takeover of one of the services. And that resulted in a huge legal battle, in addition to many other things. After the Kirtland Temple, the whole Mormon movement just kind of slowly implodes, and a lot of that is also fueled by the Kirtland Safety Society. However, to the original question, accounts of people saying that they felt something or something to that effect. As far as the dedication ceremony itself goes, I am not able to come up with one off the top of my head. However, one account that does strike me specifically is Philo Dibble. And Philo Dibble was present when when Sidney Rigdon and Joseph Smith gave their revelation that became DNC 76. That's the 3 levels of heaven. They co-revealed it. They co-authored the revelation. And Philo Dibble remembers being there and a bunch of the elders in the room partaking of the sacraments. And many of them saw the Savior, many of them saw Heavenly Father. And he specifically mentions that he felt the quickening of the Spirit, but he did not see the Savior. So I interpret that data point as he didn't take enough to receive threshold dosage to cause a visual hallucination. However, he did have some kind of a physiological response to the sacrament.
More questions? Right.
Didn't know, sorry, I'm still framing the question. When Mormonism began in the early 1800s, there was a more general revival of religion in America. Was it common for other religions to also use psychoactive drugs? Like, I know there was a lot of speaking tongues and kind of all that fervory. Is there documents supporting that wider use, or is it more focused to Mormonism?
So I'm working on figuring that out right now. Like, there's no explicit accounts that are readily available of other religions talking about using that. Although, given how frequently Datura was used in medicine and whatnot at the time, it would make sense that, you know, somebody under the treatment of medicine would go to a church meeting or something and have a especially powerful experience or something like that. But I'm working on figuring out how many of the other nearby religions at the time during the Second Great Awakening were utilizing the psychedelics. So.
It's also important to contextualize the question a bit too. The concept that we have of churches today is very different than it was at the time. A common practice was community churches, where the members of the community would come together, build a church, and then multiple congregations would meet in that church because that's all the resources that the community could afford to build a church. And they also used it for community building practices or whatever activities. So the idea of a cohesive sect of Mormonism or of these other movements, the idea today is a lot more packaged and streamlined of a religious sect than it was back then. There was a lot more variability and a lot more people touring different religions and taking little bits and pieces away from many different religions. And even that's very much the case. They toyed with Methodism, they dabbled in Pentecostal.
Questions? All right. Can you elaborate on some of the mechanical components of taking the spiky plant and then
doing the things that got done, because I feel like without having that 19th century experience, I feel like I'm saying, I will smoke one marijuana or I will drop, I don't know, I don't have the knowledge to understand kind of what's actually happening, especially in the context where it's likely that surreptitious dosing is happening. Why did they taste it, and those type of questions.
Quick answer. So just for a quick example, you have the Amanita muscaria mushroom, which you eat, smoke, you can do a lot of things to it, and it doesn't have a reliable effect on a large population of people. This is because the mushroom is in large part ibotenic acid, which is hallucinogenic. It also causes gastric distress. It causes a lot of really nasty side effects. What you can do though is, and we're not giving out recipes here. But say if one were to hypothetically have an amanita mushroom that was ground and into a powder and put through a mesh screen into a wine, for example. The wine is extracting or decarboxylating the ibotenic acid into muscimol, which is 4 to 5 times more psychoactively potent and has little to no gastric side effects. So just having the appropriate vehicle for something takes something that's highly dangerous and doesn't really get you off very much into something that is very reliable. And now you have a dose response where it's you take a shot glass, you take 2 shot glasses. It's easier to self-regulate those things.
And if you want a disgusting answer, people can eat Amanita muscaria, and then if you drink their piss, that will have a reliable effect.
Origin of the reindeer story.
Yeah, in part the origin of the word shaman, actually, is handing out your sacrament to people.
There's a lot more to read on that. More questions? Yes.
I remember hearing about how the Tree of Life, one of the temples, and I'm not sure, I don't remember which one, there was an intention to have an actual tree that had fruit either on it or under it, and there's speculation that could have been mushrooms. Can you speak to that? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, there was one.
This is new information.
Oh, we talked about it the other day.
Nothing verifiable that I've seen so far, but I just heard about it the other day. Yeah.
You can look it up. There's references to it in one of the earliest temple endowment exposés, if you want to call it that. The website I can think of, I think it's ldsendowment.com or .org, where it goes through all the original ceremony without revealing the secrets. Every ceremony up until 2000. And so in there's an account of somebody that talks about having taken a piece of dried fruit. That's what I know about it. It does not identify the fruit. People have speculated what it is. And I think it was ice tree with a string, if I remember right.
And the original source of that is increasing Marie Van Dusen. They're the first ones to full temple expose, 1845 publication. Don, is that right?
46.
46.
All right, more questions? All right, yes.
Yeah, so thank you, first of all, for sharing your research, all of you. A number of substances were mentioned tonight, like the acacia, DMT, Amanita muscaria mushroom, datura, the nightshade toxicity. I was curious, in your opinion, potentially was a cacophony of these psychedelic substances used in the early church, or can you point to one specific agent being the primary one?
I think it's best to try and avoid single answer solutions in this case. People at that time were subject to seasonal restrictions, environmental restrictions, geographic restrictions. People were more inclined to use what they could get their hands on. So generally there were a lot of recipes that could do the same thing, if that makes sense. Much the same way facilitators today use multiple compounds to essentially do the same thing. It was kind of similar in my opinion.
A little more on that. So the Ebenezer Sidney's book provided the occult properties of the herbs, which also provided their governing planets, which you could use in conjunction with pictures of these or descriptions of them, as well as almanacs and calendars in order to know what time of year to find what plant at what and that would create kind of a broad appeal. But as far as the original question goes, the elegant solution is the church leaders who were doing this were judicious about what plant to use at what time because they knew what they were doing with this.
Well, and they'd mix plants that were under the same power, so under the power of Jupiter, under the power of Saturn. They would combine multiple of those plants together to increase the magical potency of it. And frequently, you had multiple psychedelic plants under the same sign that could be mixed together.
More questions? Yes.
Orson Pratt was not in town when they had the early dedication, and he was on a mission. He came back. And as I remember hearing that he was in some classes. Anyway, that he lamented he didn't get to see the angels like everyone else. Being the more scientific than the majority of the members were, and this is I total speculation, but on the scale of speculation of possibility versus probability, the fact that he was more scientifically minded was Joseph less likely to try to have to give him spiked wine because he might, would a scientific person notice the difference between spiked wine and not spiked wine as much as an average, less scientifically minded person?
Yeah. Question? I actually attribute William McCullen leaving to psychedelics. I believe that he knew, or he found out, because William McCullen was brought in into the inner ranks for a brief period of time, participated in the School of Prophets. But then he had a very mysterious falling out. I believe that he learned the secrets, he learned the keys to the kingdom of God, and he was just pleased with him.
We got to talk about that. I want to hear more about that.
Yeah.
We've got, we got time for a couple more. There are a couple more questions. Yes.
So I have a little bit of a question, more of again speculation of why we don't have explicit mentions. Considering things like it's not illegal at that time for these substances, and a lot of it because you're around the herbalists and everything, the herbalist just kind of knows. And you mentioned we're like trying to do this thing, and I don't want to throw out just immediately, power control, hide it, give the people deal. It starts to get shady. But like, why don't we have explicit mention of how to get to all of these religious states?
I have a complicated answer. Okay, so to begin, the prejudices that we see today of like the educated or the wealthy looking down on scorn of people who use drugs, those prejudices existed at the time. And they were captured in the first vision, or not the first vision, I'm sorry, in the vision of Lehi, in the Book of Mormon. Right? The wealthy, educated ones in the tower are laughing with scorn at the people who are partaking of the plan. Right? So the cultural prejudices, right, like a lot of the early Mormons were not educated. A lot of them came from the same demographic as Joseph Smith, who were anti-establishment. And this is Jackson's America. Jackson was a populist, anti-establishment American president. So it was a matter of recognizing that the prejudices exist, keeping in mind market competitors. Joseph Smith was always paying attention to his market competitors. He spoke about them frequently, whether that was William Miller or Joanna Southcott or the Republican versus or whatever. He spoke about his market competitors. I believe that he understood that if his competitors knew, or if some publication knew that he was using these things, then it would immediately cast his entire ministry into ridicule. And I believe that contributed to him adopting pretty early on the concept of keeping these within very tightly knit circles. Like at the Morley farm, we're talking about 1,000 people in the church. That's it. Same with the School of the Prophets. At the height of the School of the Prophets, it's maybe 3 to 4 dozen. That's it. Right. These are very, very small groups. It's only only with the Kirtland Temple that he finally, it appears that Joseph said, "How big can I go?"
So it seems like it's mostly just a cultural need to kind of like, again, control prejudices and market stuff rather than some type of militant intent, right?
Yeah, and a lot of people at the time were less concerned with the mechanics of magic so much as the results of them. So like, I don't care that I drank a potion and I did a circle and I did a thing and all the stuff. I care that you did the thing you promised me you were going to do magically. And Some people, the more uneducated, may not have even made a connection with the potion they drank. You know what I mean? And then when they learn, oh my God, the magic's in the potion, sometimes you get people who are upset. Like, you know what I mean? It's a very nuanced conversation, much like today.
But not to be lost, though. I do not believe that there is malicious intent. I believe that there are interpretations, there are situations, especially in Nauvoo, where plant medicines were used very unethically and for nefarious purposes, malicious purposes. However, early on, I do sincerely believe that Joseph Smith understood that this is how you commune with deity. And he really wanted other people to experience that personal revelation and administration with him, just like he does. I do try and look at it with the most benefit of the doubt, a benevolent pursuit. Really. Once Nauvoo comes along, it's a different story.
Did Joseph use it with malicious intent, or was that other people surrounding it? Like, do you have specific instances?
For Nauvoo?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, so one of the magic books, I believe this is in Ebenezer Sibley's book, I'm going to try and be delicate here. It describes a certain concoction that a person can keep under their tongue and pass to somebody when they kiss that acts as what they term as an aphrodisiac. I wouldn't call it that. We have words for those drugs today. But you can obviously see how something like that could be utilized in the legal polygamy. Also with polygamy, John C. Bennett specifically, he was accused of offering a woman some white powder to give to her husband so that he could take her as a spiritual wife. There was an expose that was written in 1844 by Joseph Jackson, who said that Joseph Smith had captains in the Relief Society, that certain women he could tell a man was from Missouri, and they would mix a white powder with his victuals and rob him and dump his body in Mississippi. So Nauvoo is a criminal empire. But before that, Kirtland, the visionary era, things are great. Things are fun. Things are a lot better there. Sunshine and roses.
All right, well, we are out of time. Thank you so much. There's a couple reminders. Okay, so we're going to see up brewing after this, and then tomorrow at the Guildhall Garden. Okay, Amanda just mentioned that she also does entheogenic session work specifically for people with religious trauma, and she has more background. So if you have interest in this, Amanda is right here. You can talk to her after the event. And one more thing, and I'm not joking when I say this, Cody's book will be available for sale from the back of his car in the parking lot.
Follow me outside.
This is one of your only chances, and so yeah, follow Cody around.
LSD fits in between pages.
Your hands, good luck, see you tonight and tomorrow some more. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, guys.
Has done a lot of